Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? The town of Millbrook had always been the sort of place where nothing much happened, and that was exactly how its residents preferred it. Nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered in oak and maple trees, the community of just over 3,000 souls had maintained its peaceful rhythm for generations. Main Street stretched for exactly 12 blocks, lined with brick buildings that had weathered nearly a century of seasons, their facades painted in muted colors that seemed to blend naturally with the changing sky. On any given morning, the same familiar figures could be seen making their rounds. Mrs. Henderson would unlock the front door of her general store at precisely 7:30, the brass bell above the entrance announcing her arrival with its gentle chime. 2 blocks down, Thomas Chun would be arranging fresh produce outside his family's grocery, the wooden crates creating neat rows of seasonal offerings that caught the early sunlight. The postal worker, Jim Morrison, would begin his route at 8 o'clock sharp, his canvas bag heavy with letters and packages that connected Millbrook to the wider world beyond the hills. The police station occupied a modest 2-story building on Elm Street, its red brick exterior distinguished by 4 tall windows that looked out over the town square. Inside, the building retained the quiet atmosphere of a place where serious work was conducted at an unhurried pace. The main floor housed a small reception area, 2 offices, and a meeting room that doubled as storage for the extensive filing cabinets that contained decades of local records. Chief Patricia Wells had overseen the department for 8 years, managing a staff of 3 full-time officers and 2 part-time deputies who covered the surrounding rural areas. The cases that crossed Chief Wells' desk were typically straightforward matters. Reports of stolen bicycles, minor traffic incidents, disputes between neighbors over property lines, and the occasional complaint about noise levels during the monthly town social gatherings. The filing cabinets contained folders thick with documentation of these everyday concerns, each incident carefully recorded and filed, away in the methodical system that Chief Wells had inherited from her predecessor and refined. Over the years. It was on a Tuesday morning in late September when the first unusual report arrived at the station. The leaves on the maple trees lining Main Street had begun their transformation to deep reds and golden yellows, and the air carried the crisp scent of autumn that signaled the approaching change of seasons. Officer David Martinez was working the morning shift, reviewing the previous night's patrol reports, when Eleanor Ashford appeared at the front desk. Mrs. Ashford was well known in Millbrook as a woman of precise habits and careful observation. At 72 years old, she maintained a daily routine that took her from her small house on Birch Avenue to the library, then to the post office, and finally to the general store before returning home by lunchtime. Her route never varied, and her timing was so consistent that other residents often used her schedule as an informal clock for their own activities. The concern that brought Mrs. Ashford to the police station that morning was, she explained to Officer Martinez, something that had been troubling her for several days. During her regular morning walk, she had noticed changes in the routine of another resident, a man named Robert Thornfield who lived alone in a house at the end of Cedar Lane. For the past 3 weeks, Mrs. Ashford had observed Mr. Thornfield leaving his house each evening at exactly 9:15, carrying what appeared to be a small canvas bag. This departure time struck Mrs. Ashford as unusual because Mr. Thornfield, a retired postal worker in his 60s, had always been known for his early bedtime. Throughout the summer months, the lights in his house would typically be extinguished by 8:30, and his car would remain parked in his driveway until the following morning. The change in this long-established pattern had caught Mrs. Ashford's attention, particularly because Mr. Thornfield would return home each night at different times, sometimes as early as 10 o'clock, other times not until well after midnight. Officer Martinez listened to Mrs. Ashford's account with the patient attention that such reports required. In a small town like Millbrook, Changes in personal routines were often the first indication of circumstances that might require police attention, even if those circumstances were ultimately benign. He took careful notes of the dates and times that Mrs. Ashford had observed these departures, noting the consistency of the 9:15 departure time and the variability of the return schedule. After Mrs. Ashford left the station, Officer Martinez reviewed the incident reports from the past month to see if any other unusual activities had been documented. The files revealed nothing beyond the typical minor incidents, but he made a note to include Mr. Thornfield's address in the evening patrol route to observe the situation firsthand. That evening, Officer Martinez positioned his patrol car on Oak Street, which provided a clear view of Cedar Lane without being conspicuous to residents. The autumn evening was clear and cool, with the first stars becoming visible in the darkening sky above the surrounding hills. At 9:10, the porch light at Mr. Thornfield's house illuminated, and 5 minutes later, the man emerged carrying a small dark bag. Just as Mrs. Ashford had described, Mr. Thornfield walked to his car, a well-maintained sedan that he had owned for nearly a decade, and drove slowly down Cedar Lane toward the town center. Officer Martinez waited until the vehicle had turned onto Main Street before beginning a discreet follow at a distance that would not alert Mr. Thornfield to his presence. The sedan proceeded through the quiet streets at a moderate pace, passing the shuttered shops and the few streetlights that marked the main thoroughfares. Instead of remaining within the town limits, Mr. Thornfield's route led to County Road 15, which wound through farmland and wooded areas toward the neighboring community of Riverside, 15 miles to the east. Officer Martinez continued following at a respectful distance, noting the precise turns and the steady speed that Mr. Thornfield maintained. Throughout the journey, the destination proved to be a small roadside establishment called Murphy's Tavern, located at a crossroads between Millbrook and Riverside. The building was a converted farmhouse that had served as a gathering place for residents of the rural area for over 40 years. Its parking lot contained perhaps a dozen vehicles, and warm light spilled from the windows onto the gravel surface outside. Officer Martinez parked his patrol car in a position that allowed him to observe the tavern while remaining unnoticed, among the shadows cast by a grove of pine trees. Through the windows he could see figures moving about inside, though the distance and lighting made it impossible to distinguish individual faces or activities. Mr. Thornfield's car remained in the parking lot for approximately 2 hours before he emerged from the building and began the return journey to Millbrook. The return trip followed the same route in reverse, with Mr. Thornfield maintaining the same careful driving pace that had characterized the outbound journey. Officer Martinez noted the time of arrival back at Cedar Lane as 11:25 and observed that the house lights were extinguished within 15 minutes of Mr. Thornfield's return. Over the following week, Officer Martinez repeated this observation on 2 additional evenings, confirming the consistency of the 9:15 departure time while noting slight variations in the return schedule. On one night, Mr. Thornfield returned at 10:40, while on another, he did not arrive home until nearly midnight. The destination remained the same in each case: Murphy's Tavern on County Road 15. Chief Wells reviewed Officer Martinez's reports with interest, though she acknowledged that the observed behavior fell well within the bounds of normal adult activity. Mr. Thornfield was not violating any laws by visiting a tavern in the evening, and the careful, law-abiding manner of his driving suggested no cause for concern regarding public safety. However, the change in routine was sufficiently pronounced that it warranted continued monitoring, particularly given Mrs. Ashford's reputation for accurate observation. The chief decided to conduct a background review of Mr. Thornfield's history in Millbrook, consulting the various records and files that the police department maintained. Robert Thornfield had moved to the town 12 years earlier, following his retirement from the postal service in a larger city to the south. He had purchased the house on Cedar Lane from the estate of its previous owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Collins, who had lived there for over 50 years. Mr. Thornfield's integration into the community had been gradual but successful. He participated in the town's annual festivals, maintained his property to the high standards expected in the neighborhood, and had developed casual friendships with several other residents. The police files contain no reports of any incidents involving Mr. Thornfield, and his interactions with local merchants and service providers had always been described as courteous and appropriate. The house on Cedar Lane itself had a history that stretched back to the early days of Millbrook's development. Built in the 1940s by a local contractor named William Hayes, it had been designed as a modest family home with 2 bedrooms, a single bathroom, and a small basement that served as storage space. The architectural style was typical of its era, with clean lines and practical features that reflected the sensibilities of post-war construction. Margaret Collins had purchased the house in 1952 as a young bride, moving there with her husband Frank after their wedding. The couple had raised 2 children in the home, both of whom had eventually moved to other parts of the country to pursue careers and start families of their own. After Frank's death in 1987, Margaret had continued living alone in the house, maintaining its condition through careful attention and regular upkeep. The sale of the house to Mr. Thornfield had been handled through the local real estate office, with all documentation properly filed and recorded at the county courthouse. The transaction had proceeded without complications, and Mr. Thornfield had taken possession of the property in excellent condition, including the mature shade trees and well-established garden that Margaret Collins had tended for decades. As Chief Wells reviewed these records, she noted that the basement of the house had been mentioned in the original construction documents as being partially finished, with concrete floors and walls that provided adequate storage space for typical household items. The building inspector's reports from various maintenance visits over the years had consistently described the basement as dry and structurally sound, with proper ventilation and electrical systems. This information became relevant when Officer Martinez reported an additional observation from his surveillance of Mr. Thornfield's evening activities. On the most recent night that he had monitored the routine, Martinez had noticed that Mr. Thornfield carried not only the small canvas bag when leaving the house, but also returned with what appeared to be a different bag or container, slightly larger and seemingly heavier based on the way he carried it. The mystery of these evening excursions deepened when Chief Wells decided to make a casual visit to Murphy's Tavern during her off-duty hours to assess the establishment and its patrons. Murphy's Tavern occupied a unique position in the social landscape of the rural area between Millbrook and Riverside, serving as a neutral gathering place for residents of both communities as well as the farming families who lived in the surrounding countryside. The interior of the tavern retained the comfortable atmosphere of its origins as a farmhouse, with exposed wooden beams, stone fireplace, and furniture that spoke of decades of use and care. The clientele on the evening of Chief Wells' visit consisted primarily of middle-aged and older adults, many of whom appeared to be regular patrons based on their easy familiarity with the staff and their comfortable interactions with one another. Behind the bar, the owner, Sean Murphy, was a man in his 50s who had inherited the business from his father and maintained its reputation as a respectable establishment that served the social needs of the local community. Chief Wells introduced herself and engaged in the sort of casual conversation that often provided valuable insights into local activities and concerns. Mr. Murphy confirmed that Robert Thornfield had indeed become a regular patron over the past month, typically arriving around 9:30 in the evening and remaining until closing time or slightly before. According to Murphy's observations, Mr. Thornfield was a quiet customer who preferred to sit at a corner table where he could observe the room without being conspicuous. He would order a single beer, which he would nurse throughout his stay, and spent most of his time reading or writing in a small notebook. The notebook details struck Chief Wells as particularly interesting, as it provided a potential explanation for the canvas bag that Officer Martinez had observed. Murphy described the notebook as being bound in dark leather, approximately the size of a standard paperback book, and mentioned that Mr. Thornfield seemed to write in it regularly throughout his visits. What made Mr. Thornfield's presence at the tavern more intriguing was Murphy's observation that the retired postal worker showed particular interest in conversations occurring at nearby tables. While he never participated directly in these discussions, Murphy had noticed that Thornfield seemed to listen carefully to conversations about local events, family news, and community happenings that were shared among the other patrons. This behavior might have been dismissed as simple curiosity or loneliness if not for one additional detail that Murphy shared with Chief Wells. On several occasions, he had observed Mr. Thornfield making notes in his book immediately after overhearing specific pieces of information, particularly details about residents' travel plans, work schedules, or family circumstances. Chief Wells thanked Murphy for his time and discreetly observed the tavern's other patrons for the remainder of the evening. The conversations she overheard were typical of such gatherings: discussions of weather and crops, updates on family members, complaints about local government decisions, and shared memories of community events. However, she could understand how someone systematically recording such information might gradually compile a comprehensive picture of the personal lives and routines of area residents. The next morning, Chief Wells convened a meeting with her officers to discuss the Thornfield situation and determine whether additional investigation was warranted. Officer Martinez presented his surveillance reports, while Officer Sarah Kim, who had been conducting patrols in the Cedar Lane area, reported her own observations of the neighborhood and its residents. Officer Kim had noticed that Mr. Thornfield's house showed signs of unusual activity beyond the evening departures. During daylight hours, the windows were often covered with curtains or blinds that had not been there during his first years of residence. Additionally, Kim had observed that Thornfield had installed new exterior lighting around his property, including motion-activated fixtures that illuminated the driveway and side yard whenever anyone approached. These modifications to his home were not violations of any local ordinances, but they represented significant changes to the property's appearance and suggested a heightened concern for privacy or security. Officer Kim had also noted that Mr. Thornfield had recently begun having regular deliveries from suppliers that she did not recognize, with packages and boxes being left at his front door during times when he was presumably inside the house. The delivery detail prompted Chief Wells to contact the local postal service and package delivery companies to inquire about any unusual shipping patterns to Mr. Thornfield's address. The inquiries revealed that over the past 2 months, he had received an increasing number of packages from electronic suppliers, office supply companies, and specialty retailers that dealt in items such as filing systems, storage containers, and organizational equipment. While none of these purchases were inherently suspicious, the pattern suggested that Mr. Thornfield was engaged in some sort of project that required considerable organization and documentation. Combined with the notebook writing at Murphy's Tavern and the systematic observation of local residents' conversations, these purchases began to paint a picture of someone who was methodically collecting and organizing information about his community. Chief Wells decided that the situation warranted a formal approach to Mr. Thornfield to determine the nature of his activities and ensure that they did not pose any threat to community safety. However, she also recognized the importance of respecting his privacy rights while conducting this inquiry, particularly since no laws had been broken and no complaints had been filed against him. The approach would need to be carefully planned to avoid creating unnecessary alarm or antagonism while still gathering the information needed to assess the situation properly. Chief Wells considered various options, including a direct conversation, a request for voluntary cooperation, or continued surveillance until more definitive information could be obtained. As she weighed these alternatives, Chief Wells reflected on the unique challenges that small-town policing presented. In a community where everyone was familiar with their neighbors' routines and personal circumstances, any deviation from established patterns was quickly noticed and often discussed among residents. The police department served not only as law enforcement, but also as a resource for addressing community concerns and maintaining the sense of security that residents expected. The case of Robert Thornfield represented exactly the sort of situation that required careful judgment and patient investigation. His activities, while unusual, might have perfectly innocent explanations. Perhaps he was writing a book about local history or conducting genealogical research. The purchases of organizational equipment might be related to a hobby or personal project that required extensive documentation. Alternatively, the systematic collection of information about neighbors, routines, and personal circumstances could indicate preparations for activities that might pose a threat to community safety. The challenge for Chief Wells was to determine which interpretation was correct without overreacting to behaviors that might ultimately prove harmless. The decision was made to approach Mr. Thornfield directly, but in a manner that would encourage cooperation rather than defensiveness. Chief Wells would visit his home during daylight hours, identify herself clearly, and explain that the police department had received general inquiries about unusual activities in the neighborhood. This approach would allow her to gauge his response and demeanor while providing him with an opportunity to explain his activities voluntarily. The visit was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon, when Officer Martinez would be positioned nearby to provide backup if needed, while Officer Kim would maintain regular patrol coverage of the surrounding area. The goal was to conduct a professional inquiry that respected Mr. Thornfield's rights while addressing the legitimate community safety concerns that had arisen from the observed changes in his behavior. Chief Wells spent considerable time preparing for this conversation, reviewing the department's protocols for such inquiries and considering the various directions that the discussion might take. She recognized that Mr. Thornfield's response to her questions would provide valuable insight into both his activities and his state of mind, information that would guide the department's next steps in addressing the situation. Afternoon chosen for the visit was clear and mild, with the autumn sun casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Millbrook. Cedar Lane appeared particularly peaceful, with its mature trees creating a canopy of red and gold leaves that rustled gently in the light breeze. The various houses along the street showed signs of their residents' preparations for the approaching winter season, with gardens being cleared and storm windows being installed. Mr. Thornfield's house stood out slightly from its neighbors due to the modifications that Officer Kim had reported. The new exterior lighting was clearly visible, and the windows were indeed covered more extensively than in previous years. The property's appearance was neat and well maintained, but the changes created an impression of increased privacy that distinguished it from the more open and welcoming aspect of neighboring homes. Chief Wells parked her patrol car in the driveway and walked to the front door, noting the small details that might provide insight into Mr. Thornfield's current circumstances. The mailbox was empty, suggesting that he collected his mail promptly each day. The newspaper delivery area showed no accumulation of undelivered papers. The front porch was clean and uncluttered, with a single chair positioned to provide a view of the street. When Chief Wells knocked on the front door, she could hear movement inside the house, followed by a pause that suggested Mr. Thornfield was observing her through the window or door viewer before deciding whether to answer. After a few moments, the door opened to reveal a man of average height and build, neatly dressed in casual clothes, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that regarded her with polite but cautious attention. Mr. Thornfield greeted Chief Wells courteously and invited her inside, leading her to a living room that was furnished comfortably but Spartanly. The room was remarkably organized, with books arranged alphabetically on built-in shelves, magazines stacked in neat piles, and no clutter or personal items visible on the various surfaces. The overall impression was of a space maintained by someone who valued order and precision in their environment. Chief Wells explained the purpose of her visit in general terms, mentioning that the police department periodically checked with residents about any concerns or observations they might have regarding neighborhood activities. She noted that several people had mentioned seeing unusual activity in the area and wanted to ensure that everyone felt secure in their homes and daily routines. Mr. Thornfield listened to this explanation with careful attention, occasionally nodding to indicate his understanding. When Chief Wells finished speaking, he thanked her for her concern and acknowledged that he had indeed made some changes to his daily routine over the past month. He explained that retirement had left him with considerable free time, and he had begun exploring new activities and interests to occupy his evenings. Conversation that followed was conducted in polite and measured tones, with both participants choosing their words carefully. Mr. Thornfield confirmed that he had been visiting Murphy's Tavern regularly, describing it as an opportunity to socialize with other residents of the area and learn more about the community's history and current affairs. He acknowledged keeping a notebook, which he characterized as a journal where he recorded observations and thoughts about local events and personalities. When Chief Wells inquired about the packages and deliveries that had been observed, Mr. Thornfield explained that he had begun organizing his personal papers and belongings more systematically. The purchases of filing equipment and organizational supplies were part of this project, which he described as an effort to create a comprehensive record of his years in Millbrook and the relationships he had developed with other residents. This explanation was plausible and consistent with the activities of many retirees who undertook similar projects to organize their lives and preserve their experiences for family, members, or personal satisfaction. However, something in Mr. Thornfield's manner suggested to Chief Wells that his description might be incomplete or carefully edited to present his activities in the most benign possible light. The conversation concluded with Mr. Thornfield thanking Chief Wells for her visit and assuring her that his activities posed no concern for community safety. He volunteered to contact the police department if he observed anything unusual in the neighborhood and expressed appreciation for the attention that the department paid to resident security and as Chief Wells prepared to leave, she noticed a door that appeared to lead to the basement and recalled the building records that mentioned the partially finished lower level of the house. She commented casually on the home's layout and history, prompting Mr. Thornfield to offer a brief tour of the main floor. However, he did not extend the invitation to include the basement, and Chief Wells did not press the matter during this initial contact. The visit concluded cordially, with both participants maintaining the polite formality that such encounters required. Chief Wells returned to her patrol car with more questions than answers, but also with valuable impressions of Mr. Thornfield's personality and current state of mind. He had been cooperative and responsive to her inquiries, but she sensed an underlying tension that suggested he was carefully managing both his words and his reactions. Back at the police station, Chief Wells reviewed her notes from the conversation and considered the various interpretations that could be placed on Mr. Thornfield's explanations. His account of his activities was consistent with the observations that had been made, but it also seemed somewhat rehearsed, as though he had anticipated such questions and prepared appropriate responses. The mention of organizing personal papers and creating records of his time in Millbrook was particularly interesting because it suggested a level of documentation that went beyond typical personal filing systems. Combined with the systematic note-taking at Murphy's Tavern and the apparent interest in neighbors' personal circumstances, this activity pattern raised questions about the scope and purpose of Mr. Thornfield's information collection. Chief Wells decided to continue monitoring the situation while researching additional background information about Mr. Thornfield's history and activities. The investigation would proceed carefully and methodically, respecting his privacy rights while ensuring that any potential community safety concerns were properly addressed. Asterisk. The following days brought additional observations and details that gradually filled in the picture of Mr. Thornfield's current activities. Officer Martinez reported that the evening visits to Murphy's Tavern continued with clockwork regularity, always beginning at 9:15 and following the same route to and from the establishment. However, the return times had become more consistent, typically occurring around 11:30, suggesting that Mr. Thornfield had established a routine. Even within his new pattern of behavior, Mrs. Ashford contacted the police station, again to report that she had observed additional changes in the neighborhood. During her morning walks, she had noticed that Mr. Thornfield appeared to be conducting his own surveillance of the area, occasionally standing at his front window for extended periods and watching the activities of other residents. She had also seen him photographing various houses and street scenes, using a camera with a telephoto lens that allowed him to capture detailed images from a distance. This photography activity raised new concerns about Mr. Thornfield's intentions and the nature of his information collection project. While photographing public areas was not illegal, the systematic documentation of neighbors, properties, and activities suggested a level of surveillance that might make other residents uncomfortable if they became aware of it. Asterisk. Officer Kim conducted additional patrols of the Cedar Lane area and confirmed Mrs. Ashford's observations about the photography. She had observed Mr. Thornfield on 2 occasions taking pictures of houses and yards from various positions along the street, always in a manner that appeared deliberate and methodical rather than casual or artistic. The telephoto lens allowed him to capture detailed images while maintaining distance from his subjects, suggesting that he preferred to conduct this activity without being noticed by the property owners. Chief Wells consulted with the department's legal advisor about the implications of Mr. Thornfield's activities and the appropriate limits of police investigation in such circumstances. The advisor confirmed that photographing public areas and gathering information through casual observation were protected activities that did not provide grounds for formal police intervention. However, if the activities escalated to harassment, trespassing, or other violations of law, the department would have clear authority to take action. The challenge was determining whether Mr. Thornfield's current activities represented preparation for such violations or were simply the unusual hobbies of a retired man seeking to occupy his time. The systematic nature of his information collection suggested planning and organization that might be consistent with either innocent or concerning intentions. As the investigation continued, Chief Wells began to develop a more complete picture of the quiet changes that had been occurring in Millbrook over the past several months. The case of Robert Thornfield had drawn attention to the importance of community awareness and the role that careful observation played in maintaining local security and peace of mind. The town's residents had demonstrated their commitment to looking out for one another through their willingness to report unusual activities and their cooperation with police inquiries. This community vigilance was one of Millbrook's greatest strengths, providing an early warning system that helped prevent minor concerns from developing into serious problems. However, the case also highlighted the delicate balance between community safety and individual privacy that small-town policing required. Chief Wells and her officers needed to address residents' concerns while respecting the rights of all community members, including those whose behaviors might be unconventional but not necessarily threatening. The investigation of Mr. Thornfield's activities would continue, guided by the principles of thorough but respectful inquiry that had served the Millbrook Police Department well over the years. The goal was not to intrude unnecessarily into anyone's private affairs, but rather to ensure that all Residents could feel secure in their homes and confident in their communities. Commitment to their safety and well-being as autumn deepened and the first frost touched the gardens of Millbrook. The quiet work of understanding and protecting the community continued in the measured, careful manner that had always characterized life in this peaceful valley town. The story of Robert Thornfield and his unusual activities was just beginning to unfold, promising to test the wisdom and patience of all those involved in maintaining the delicate balance between security and freedom that made Millbrook the sort of place where people chose to build their lives. The rhythm of life in Millbrook had always been measured by the steady pulse of familiar routines, each day flowing into the next with the comfortable predictability that small communities treasure. As October settled over the valley, bringing crisp mornings and the gentle drift of leaves from the maple trees, the police department found itself drawn deeper into the quiet mystery that Robert Thornfield had introduced to their peaceful town. Chief Wells began each morning with a careful review of the incident reports that accumulated overnight, a practice that had served her well throughout her tenure. The reports typically consisted of minor disturbances, requests for welfare checks, and occasional complaints about barking dogs or loud music that disturbed the evening quiet. These daily documents formed a continuous record of community life, capturing the small disruptions and concerns that required attention from local law enforcement. On the morning following her visit to Mr. Thornfield's house, Chief Wells noticed a subtle change in the pattern of these reports. Over the past 2 weeks, there had been a gradual increase in calls from residents reporting unusual activities in their neighborhoods. Mrs. Patterson on Maple Street had called to report seeing someone walking through the alley behind her house at unusual hours. Mr. Davidson near the town center had observed a person taking photographs of storefronts early in the morning before the shops opened. The elderly couple who lived on Pine Avenue had mentioned seeing someone examining the mailboxes along their street with what appeared to be more than casual interest. Individually, these reports might have been dismissed as the normal concerns of residents who were perhaps more observant than usual due to seasonal changes or personal circumstances. However, when viewed collectively, they suggested a pattern of surveillance or reconnaissance activity that extended beyond the specific case of Robert Thornfield. The locations mentioned in these reports formed a rough circle around the town center, encompassing most of the residential neighborhoods and commercial areas that made up the heart of Millbrook. Officer Martinez was assigned to conduct follow-up interviews with each of the residents who had filed these reports, gathering additional details about the times, locations, and nature of the activities they had observed. His conversations with these community members revealed a level of detail that spoke to their deep familiarity with the normal patterns of life in their neighborhoods and their sensitivity to deviations from those established routines. Mrs. Patterson described seeing a figure moving through the alley behind her house on 3 separate occasions, always between 10 and 11 o'clock at night. The person appeared to be examining the rear entrances of houses and noting the locations of windows, doors, and exterior lighting. While the individual never attempted to enter any properties or engage in obviously criminal behavior, the systematic nature of this examination had concerned Mrs. Patterson enough to report it to the police. Mr. Davidson's observations were particularly detailed due to his habit of rising early for morning walks before beginning his workday at the local bank. He had noticed someone photographing the storefronts along Main Street on 4 different mornings, always around 6:30 when the street was nearly deserted. The photographer appeared to be documenting not only the businesses themselves, but also their hours of operation, security systems, and the general layout of the commercial district. The couple on Pine Avenue had observed someone conducting what appeared to be a survey of the mailboxes in their neighborhood, noting the names of residents and making written records of the information displayed on each box. This activity had occurred during mid-morning hours when most residents were at work or engaged in their daily routines. suggesting that the observer had timed these activities to avoid detection or confrontation. Officer Martinez compiled these reports into a comprehensive summary that painted a picture of systematic information gathering across multiple areas of the town. The activities described by residents were consistent with reconnaissance operations that someone might conduct in preparation for more invasive actions, though they could also represent legitimate research or documentation projects that posed no threat to community safety. Chief Wells reviewed Officer Martinez's findings while considering the broader implications of this pattern of activity. The timing and locations of the observed surveillance suggested careful planning and local knowledge that would be difficult for an outsider to possess. The systematic approach indicated that someone was conducting a methodical study of Millbrook's layout, routines, and security arrangements, though the ultimate purpose of this study remained unclear. Asterisk. The connection between these various observations and Robert Thornfield's activities was not immediately obvious, but the timing of the reports suggested a possible relationship. The increase in surveillance activities had begun approximately 3 weeks earlier, coinciding with Mr. Thornfield's establishment of his regular evening routine at Murphy's Tavern. While this correlation might be coincidental, it warranted careful investigation to determine whether a single individual was responsible for all of these activities. Officer Sarah Kim was tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of the patrol logs from the past month to identify any patterns or connections that might have been missed during routine operations. Her analysis revealed that the locations were unusual. Activities had been reported were all accessible by routes that avoided the main streets and intersections, where patrol cars were most likely to be positioned during evening and overnight hours. Asterisk. This observation suggested that whoever was conducting these surveillance activities possessed detailed knowledge of police patrol patterns and had planned their movements to minimize the risk of detection. Such knowledge could have been obtained through careful observation over time, or it might indicate someone with previous experience in law enforcement or security operations. The possibility that Mr. Thornfield might have such a background prompted Chief Wells to conduct a more thorough investigation of his personal history and employment record. The initial background check conducted when he first moved to Millbrook had been routine and superficial, focusing primarily on his postal service employment and his financial qualifications for purchasing the house on Cedar Lane. A deeper investigation revealed that Mr. Thornfield's career with the Postal Service had included several years working in the inspection division, investigating cases of mail theft, fraud, and other crimes related to postal operations. This experience would have provided him with training in surveillance techniques, evidence collection, and the systematic documentation of suspicious activities. While postal inspectors were not law enforcement officers in the traditional sense, their work required many of the same skills and approaches used by police investigators. This discovery placed Mr. Thornfield's current activities in a new context. His systematic note-taking at Murphy's Tavern, his careful documentation of neighbors' routines, and his apparent coordination of surveillance activities throughout Millbrook could represent the application of professional investigative techniques to some personal project or concern. However, the nature of this project remained unclear, and the potential implications for community safety required continued attention. Chief Wells decided to expand the investigation to include a review of any connections between Mr. Thornfield and other residents of Millbrook who might be the focus of his apparent surveillance activities. This research involved examining property records, employment histories, and social connections that might explain why certain individuals or locations had attracted his attention. The process of mapping these connections proved to be a complex undertaking that required careful attention to privacy rights and legal limitations on police investigation. Chief Wells worked closely with the department's legal advisor to ensure that all research activities remained within appropriate bounds while gathering the information needed to assess the situation properly. One of the first patterns to emerge from this analysis involved the residents who had reported unusual surveillance activities in their neighborhoods. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Davidson, and the couple on Pine Avenue all shared certain characteristics that might have made them particularly observant of changes in their environment. All were long-term residents of Millbrook with well-established routines and deep familiarity with the normal patterns of activity in their areas. More significantly, all three households had experienced significant life changes within the past year that had altered their daily routines and increased their presence at home during times when they might not previously have been available to observe neighborhood activities. Mrs. Patterson had recently retired from her job at the school district. Mr. Davidson had begun working from home several days per week, and the elderly couple had reduced their travel and social activities due to the health concerns. These changes in routine might have made these residents more likely to notice surveillance activities that had been occurring undetected for some time. Alternatively, the timing might suggest that someone had been monitoring the community long enough to identify which residents were most likely to observe and report unusual activities, and had adjusted their methods accordingly. The investigation also revealed that several of the locations where surveillance had been reported were connected to residents who had been the subject of discussions at Murphy's Tavern during Mr. Thornfield's evening visits. Sean Murphy, the tavern owner, confirmed that conversations among patrons often included updates on neighbors' activities, travel plans, and personal circumstances that formed the social fabric of the rural community. Connection between tavern conversations and subsequent surveillance activities suggested that Mr. Thornfield might be using the information gathered during his evening visits to guide more detailed investigations of specific individuals or properties. The systematic nature of this approach indicated planning and organization that went far beyond casual curiosity about neighbors' affairs. Officer Kim's continued analysis of patrol logs revealed additional patterns that supported this interpretation. The timing of reported surveillance activities often coincided with periods when the subjects of that surveillance were known to be away from their homes or businesses. This timing suggested that someone was using advance knowledge of residents' schedules to conduct more thorough examinations of their properties without risk of detection or confrontation. The implications of this discovery were significant for both the current investigation and the broader question of community security in Millbrook. If Mr. Thornfield was indeed conducting systematic surveillance of his neighbors based on information gathered through social interactions, his activities represented a serious invasion of privacy that might escalate to more threatening behavior. Chief Wells convened a meeting with her officers to discuss the findings of their investigation and develop a comprehensive response to the situation. The meeting took place in the department's conference room, a small space lined with filing cabinets and dominated by a large table that served multiple functions throughout the day. The autumn afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, creating long shadows that shifted gradually as the discussion progressed. Officer Martinez presented his findings from the interviews with residents who had reported surveillance activities, including detailed maps showing the locations and timing of the observed incidents. His analysis demonstrated clear patterns in both the geographic distribution of these activities and their relationship to the daily routines of community members. Officer Kim contributed her analysis of patrol logs and her observations of changes in neighborhood security measures that residents had implemented in response to their concerns about unusual activities. Several households had installed new exterior lighting, security cameras, or alarm systems, representing a collective investment in security that reflected genuine concern about potential threats to personal safety. The discussion that followed was thorough and methodical. reflecting the careful approach that characterized all of the department's decision-making processes. Each officer contributed their observations and insights, building a comprehensive picture of the situation and its potential implications for community safety and potential implications for community safety. Individual privacy rights. Chief Wells concluded the meeting with a decision to implement enhanced patrol coverage of the affected neighborhoods while continuing the investigation of Mr. Thornfield's activities. The enhanced patrols would serve both to deter any potentially threatening behavior and to gather additional observations that might clarify the nature and scope of the surveillance activities that had been reported. The investigation would also be expanded to include consultation with law enforcement agencies in neighboring communities to determine whether similar activities had been reported elsewhere. This regional approach would help establish whether Millbrook was dealing with an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern that might require coordination with other jurisdictions. As the meeting concluded, Chief Wells reflected on the challenges that the case presented for maintaining the balance between individual privacy and community safety that was essential to small-town life. The investigation had revealed activities that were concerning but not clearly criminal, conducted by an individual who had integrated himself into the community and maintained the appearance of being a responsible and law-abiding resident. The task facing the police department was to continue monitoring and investigating these activities while respecting the legal rights of all involved parties and maintaining the trust and confidence of the community. This balance required careful judgment and patience, qualities that Chief Wells and her officers had developed through years of experience in serving the needs of Millbrook's residents. The enhanced patrol schedule was implemented the following evening, with officers positioned to provide comprehensive coverage of the areas where surveillance activities had been reported. The patrols were conducted in a manner designed to be visible to residents, while not being so obvious as to interfere with normal community activities or alert potential surveillance operators to the increased police presence. Officer Martinez took the first shift, covering the neighborhoods around Maple Street and the town center, where some of the most detailed surveillance activities had been observed. His patrol route was designed to provide regular coverage of these areas while maintaining the flexibility to respond to any unusual activities that might occur during his shift. The evening was quiet and clear, with the first hints of winter's approach evident in the sharpness of the air and the early onset of darkness. The streetlights cast pools of warm light along the residential streets, creating a sense of security and normalcy that contrasted with the underlying concerns that had prompted the increased patrol coverage. At 9:15, Officer Martinez observed Mr. Thornfield leaving his house on Cedar Lane according to his established routine, carrying the familiar canvas bag and walking with the measured pace that had characterized his movements throughout the period of observation. The patrol car followed at a discreet distance as Mr. Thornfield made his way to Murphy's Tavern, confirming that this aspect of his routine remained unchanged, despite the increased police attention to his activities. However, Officer Martinez noticed subtle differences in Mr. Thornfield's behavior during the journey to the tavern. His usual direct route was modified to include several detours through residential neighborhoods, and he made brief stops at intersections where he appeared to be observing houses and noting details about their exterior features and security arrangements. These observations were conducted quickly and efficiently, suggesting familiarity with the process and comfort with the risk of detection. Mr. Thornfield's movements were confident and purposeful, indicating that he had conducted similar observations many times before and had developed effective methods for gathering information without attracting attention. Upon arriving at Murphy's Tavern, Mr. Thornfield followed his usual pattern of selecting a corner table that provided a view of the entire room while allowing him to remain relatively inconspicuous. Officer Martinez positioned his patrol car where he could observe the tavern's parking lot and main entrance while remaining hidden among the shadows cast by the surrounding trees. Inside the tavern, the evening's crowd consisted of the usual mix of local residents and rural workers who gathered to socialize and share information about community events and personal circumstances. The conversations that Officer Martinez could observe through the windows appeared typical of such gatherings, with animated discussions and occasional laughter that suggested a relaxed and friendly atmosphere. Mr. Thornfield's behavior within the tavern also followed his established pattern, with careful attention to nearby conversations and regular note-taking in his leather-bound notebook. However, Officer Martinez noticed that his subject appeared more focused and systematic in his observations than had been reported in previous surveillance sessions, suggesting either increased intensity in his information gathering activities or greater comfort with the process as it had become routine. The evening's patrol activities continued without incident until approximately 10:30, when Officer Martinez observed another vehicle arriving in the tavern's parking lot. The car was a dark sedan similar to many others in the area, but its occupant remained inside for several minutes before entering the establishment, suggesting either uncertainty about the decision to enter or deliberate observation of the other patrons and their activities. When the driver finally entered Murphy's Tavern, Officer Martinez could see through the windows that it was a woman of middle age who appeared, unfamiliar with the establishment and its regular patrons. She selected a table near the entrance, ordered a beverage, and began observing the room in a manner that seemed more systematic and professional than casual social interaction would require. The arrival of this second observer introduced a new element to the evening surveillance activities. Officer Martinez noted the time of her arrival, the license plate number of her vehicle, and her apparent focus on specific patrons within the tavern, including Robert Thornfield, who seemed unaware of her attention. The interaction between these two individuals, if any interaction was intended, remained subtle and indirect throughout the remainder of the evening. Both maintained their positions at separate tables. Both appeared to be observing other patrons and making notes, and both seemed aware of maintaining their cover as casual customers, rather than revealing any professional or investigative purpose for their presence. This development suggested that the situation in Millbrook might be more complex than initially understood, involving multiple individuals with potential surveillance or investigative interests in the community. The appearance of a second systematic observer at Murphy's Tavern raised questions about whether Mr. Thornfield was working independently or as part of a larger operation that included other participants with similar objectives. Officer Martinez maintained his surveillance of both individuals until they departed the tavern separately, with Mr. Thornfield following his usual schedule and returning home by 11:30, while the woman left approximately 15 minutes earlier and drove away in a direction that led away from Millbrook toward the neighboring communities. To the east, the patrol car followed Mr. Thornfield's return journey, confirming that he maintained his usual careful driving habits and direct route back to Cedar Lane. However, Officer Martinez also conducted a brief patrol of the route taken by the unknown woman, noting that her path led toward areas where some of the reported surveillance activities had occurred in recent weeks. These observations were documented in detail and reported to Chief Wells the following morning, adding another layer of complexity to the investigation and raising new questions about the scope and nature of the activities that had been observed in Millbrook. The case was evolving beyond the simple matter of one resident's unusual behavior into a potentially more significant investigation, involving multiple participants and unknown objectives. Chief Wells reviewed Officer Martinez's report while considering the implications of this new development for both the investigation and community safety. The appearance of additional individuals with apparent surveillance interests suggested that Millbrook might be the focus of attention from outside parties, though their connection to Mr. Thornfield and their ultimate Objectives remained unclear. The decision was made to expand the investigation to include identification of the unknown woman and any associates she might have, as well as continued monitoring of activities at Murphy's Tavern and other locations where surveillance had been reported. This expansion would require coordination with state law enforcement, agencies that had resources for conducting background investigations and surveillance operations beyond the capabilities of the local police department. As October progressed toward its end, the quiet investigation that had begun with Mrs. Ashford's observations of her neighbor's changed routine had grown into a complex case that involved multiple individuals, systematic surveillance activities, and questions about the security and privacy of an entire community. The daily rhythms of life in Millbrook continued as they had for generations, but beneath this surface normalcy, careful observers were documenting, analyzing, and possibly preparing for activities that remained hidden from the awareness of most residents. Challenge for Chief Wells and her officers was to continue their patient and methodical investigation while maintaining the delicate balance between security and privacy that made Millbrook the sort of community where people chose to build their lives. The case had tested their skills and resources, but it had also demonstrated the strength of community awareness and the importance of careful attention to the subtle changes that might indicate developing threats to local safety and peace of mind. Asterisk. The filing cabinets in the basement of the Millbrook Police Station held decades of carefully preserved records, each folder representing a chapter in the ongoing story of the community's relationship with law enforcement. Chief Wells often found herself drawn to these archives during quiet moments, reviewing old cases and incidents that had shaped the department's understanding of local patterns and concerns. It was during one such review, prompted by the expanding investigation of surveillance activities in the town, that she discovered a file that would add another dimension to the mystery surrounding Robert Thornfield and his associates. The file was labeled simply, Margaret Collins, Missing Person Report, 1999, and contained documents that Chief Wells had not reviewed since her early years with the department. Margaret Collins had been the previous owner of the house on Cedar Lane, the elderly woman who had sold the property to Robert Thornfield 12 years earlier. According to the records, Mrs. Collins had been reported missing by her neighbor 3 weeks after the sale of her house had been completed, and she had supposedly moved to live with relatives in another state. The missing person report had been filed by Eleanor Ashford, the same observant resident who had recently brought concerns about Mr. Thornfield's evening activities to the attention of the police. Mrs. Ashford's 1999 report described her growing concern about Margaret Collins' sudden disappearance from the community and the lack of contact with friends and acquaintances who had expected to maintain correspondence with her after her relocation. Chief Wells spread the contents of the file across her desk, reviewing each document with the careful attention that the passage of time and current circumstances demanded. The initial report described Margaret Collins as a woman in her late 70s who had lived alone in the Cedar Lane house for nearly 50 years. She had been an active member of several community organizations, maintained regular correspondence with friends and family members, and had established routines that brought her into daily contact with neighbors and local merchants. The circumstances surrounding Mrs. Collins' departure from Millbrook had been unusual from the beginning. According to the real estate records, she had contacted a broker about selling her house quite suddenly, without the months or years of consideration that typically preceded such major decisions by elderly residents. The sale had proceeded quickly, with minimal negotiation over price or terms, suggesting either urgent financial need or external pressure to complete the transaction. Rapidly. Mrs. Collins had told several neighbors that she planned to move to California to live with her nephew and his family, a decision that surprised many people because she had previously expressed strong attachment to her home and reluctance to leave the community where she had spent most of her adult life. The nephew, identified in the records as David Collins, had been contacted by police during the initial investigation and confirmed that his aunt had been welcomed to live with his family, though he expressed surprise at the suddenness of her decision. However, David Collins had reported to the investigating officers that his aunt had never arrived at his home and had not contacted him after the supposed date of her departure from Millbrook. Phone calls to the number she had provided went unanswered, and letters sent to the forwarding address she had given were returned as undeliverable. These circumstances had prompted the missing person investigation that was documented in the file. Chief Wells was now reviewing. The investigation conducted in 1999 had been thorough within the limitations of available resources and technology. Officers had interviewed neighbors, local merchants, and service providers who had regular contact with Mrs. Collins, building a comprehensive picture of her final weeks in Millbrook and the circumstances surrounding her departure. The interviews revealed several details that had concerned the investigating officers but had not provided clear evidence of criminal activity. Several witnesses reported that Mrs. Collins had seemed anxious and distracted during her final weeks in the house, a change from her usual calm and friendly demeanor. She had made unusual requests of neighbors, asking them to collect her mail and newspaper deliveries during times when she had not previously traveled or been unavailable. She had also been observed having lengthy conversations with unfamiliar visitors, including at least one individual who had been seen examining the exterior of her house and property. The real estate transaction itself had been handled through legitimate channels, with proper documentation and legal representation for both buyer and seller. However, the speed of the sale and the minimal involvement of Mrs. Collins in negotiating terms had struck the real estate agent as unusual for someone of her age and careful nature. The agent had noted that Mrs. Collins seemed eager to complete the sale as quickly as possible, even accepting an offer that was below the property's assessed value. Most significantly, the investigation had revealed that the buyer of Mrs. Collins' house had been represented by an intermediary rather than participating directly in the negotiations. The intermediary, identified as a representative of a property investment company, had handled all communications and documentation related to the purchase. The actual buyer's identity had been disclosed only at the final closing, when Robert Thornfield appeared to sign the necessary papers and take possession of the property. This detail took on new significance in light of the current investigation of Mr. Thornfield's activities. The use of an intermediary to purchase Mrs. Collins' house suggested advanced planning and a desire to avoid direct contact with the seller during the negotiation process. Combined with the circumstances of Mrs. Collins' sudden decision to sell and her subsequent disappearance, this arrangement raised questions about whether her departure from Millbrook had been entirely voluntary. Chief Wells reviewed the follow-up investigations that had been conducted over the months following the initial missing person report. Officers had contacted law enforcement agencies in California and other states where Mrs. Collins had relatives, but no trace of her had been found. Her Social Security benefits had gone unclaimed, her bank accounts had remained untouched, and no records of her seeking medical care or other services had been located. The case had been kept active for several years, with periodic reviews and updates as new information became available or investigative techniques improved. However, no significant developments had occurred, and the file had eventually been classified as a cold case with an open status that allowed for renewed investigation if circumstances warranted. The discovery of this file prompted Chief Wells to reconsider the timeline of events that had brought Robert Thornfield to Millbrook and established him as a resident of the community. His arrival had coincided exactly with Margaret Collins' disappearance, and his current activities suggested the sort of systematic approach to information gathering that might have preceded a carefully planned acquisition of property under suspicious circumstances. Officer Martinez was assigned to conduct a comprehensive review of all records related to the Collins missing person case, including contact with law enforcement agencies that had assisted in the original investigation. This review would help determine whether any new information had become available over the intervening years and whether modern investigative techniques might provide insights that had not been possible in 1999. The process of reviewing these old records revealed additional details that had not been fully explored during the original investigation. Margaret Collins had been a meticulous record keeper who maintained detailed financial records, correspondence files, and documentation of her property maintenance and improvements. These records had been left behind in the house when she departed, suggesting either haste in her departure or confidence that she would not need access to this information in her new circumstances. Mr. Thornfield's acquisition of the house had included all of Mrs. Collins' personal belongings and records, which had been described in the real estate documents as part of the property sale. This arrangement was unusual because most property transactions involved the removal of personal items by the seller, but it had been presented as a convenience that allowed Mrs. Collins to travel to California without the burden of sorting and packing decades of accumulated possessions. The inclusion of Mrs. Collins' personal records in the property sale raised questions about Mr. Thornfield's access to detailed information about her life, relationships, and activities within the community. These records would have provided him with extensive knowledge about local residents, their personal circumstances, and their connections to Mrs. Collins, information that might explain his current systematic surveillance and documentation activities. Officer Kim was tasked with conducting discreet inquiries with neighbors who had known Margaret Collins and might have additional memories or observations about the circumstances of her departure. These conversations were conducted carefully to avoid alarming residents or suggesting that the police suspected criminal activity, while still gathering information that might be relevant to both the old missing person case and the current investigation. The neighbors who had known Mrs. Collins well remembered her as a woman of strong opinions and independent nature who would not have made major life decisions without careful consideration and extensive discussion with friends and family. Her sudden decision to sell her house and move to California had been completely out of character, leading several people to express concern at the time about whether she was acting under some form of pressure or influence. Mrs. Henderson from the general store recalled that Margaret Collins had made unusual purchases during her final weeks in Millbrook, including travel supplies and packing materials that suggested preparation for a journey. However, she had also purchased items that would be needed for ongoing residence in the house, including bulk quantities of non-perishable foods and household supplies, creating contradictory evidence about her actual intentions. The postal worker who had served the Cedar Lane route in 1999 remembered that Mrs. Collins had arranged for mail forwarding to the California address, but had also maintained a post office box in Millbrook that continued to receive mail for several months after her supposed departure. This arrangement suggested either confusion about her plans or deliberate misdirection about her actual whereabouts. These details painted a picture of someone who was either genuinely uncertain about her plans or was being directed to create false impressions about her intentions. The contradictory evidence made it difficult to determine whether Mrs. Collins had left Millbrook voluntarily or had been the victim of some form of coercion or deception. Chief Wells decided to contact David Collins, Margaret Collins' nephew in California, to inform him of the renewed investigation and gather any additional information that might be relevant to understanding his aunt's disappearance. The conversation, conducted by telephone, revealed that the family had never stopped hoping for information about Margaret's whereabouts and remained convinced that her disappearance was not voluntary. David Collins provided additional context about his aunt's personality and circumstances that supported the neighbors' assessments of her character. She had been a woman who valued independence and self-determination, but who also maintained strong family connections and would not have disappeared without explanation. Her failure to maintain contact with family members was completely inconsistent with her lifelong patterns of behavior and communication. More significantly, David Collins revealed that the family had received several anonymous communications over the years, suggesting that Margaret might still be alive but unable to contact them directly. These communications had been vague and untraceable, providing no useful information about her location or circumstances, but they had maintained the family's hope that she might eventually be found. The anonymous communications had been reported to law enforcement agencies at various times, but no pattern or useful leads had been developed from them. However, their existence suggested that someone with knowledge of Margaret Collins' fate had been monitoring the family's continued efforts to locate her and possibly attempting to discourage more intensive investigation of her disappearance. This information added another layer of complexity to the case and strengthened the connection between Margaret Collins' disappearance and Robert Thornfield's subsequent residence in her former home. The systematic approach he had demonstrated in his current surveillance activities suggested the sort of careful planning and attention to detail that would be required to successfully conceal someone's fate while maintaining the appearance of a normal property transaction. Officer Martinez's review of the original investigation files revealed that several potential leads had not been fully explored due to resource limitations and the lack of clear evidence of criminal activity. One particularly intriguing detail involved reports of unfamiliar vehicles observed in the Cedar Lane area during the weeks preceding Margaret Collins' departure, including descriptions that matched vehicles later seen at locations where surveillance activities had been reported. During the current investigation, the witness descriptions from 1999 were not detailed enough to provide definitive identification of specific vehicles or individuals, but they established a pattern of external surveillance and monitoring that had preceded Margaret Collins' disappearance by several weeks. This timeline suggested advanced planning and preparation that would be consistent with a coordinated effort to acquire her property through coercion or deception. The investigation also revealed that Margaret Collins had made inquiries about personal security and home safety measures during her final months in the house, including requests for information about alarm systems and recommendations for locksmiths who could improve the security of her doors and windows. These inquiries suggested that she had been aware of potential threats to her safety and had been taking steps to protect herself. However, the security improvements she had planned were never implemented, suggesting either that her departure had occurred before the work could be completed or that the threats she perceived had escalated beyond what such measures could address. The timing of these security concerns coincided with the period when unfamiliar visitors had been observed at her house, supporting the possibility that she had been under surveillance or pressure from unknown individuals. Chief Wells compiled all of this information into a comprehensive review that connected the 1999 missing person case with the current investigation of surveillance activities in Millbrook. The connections were circumstantial but compelling, suggesting that Robert Thornfield's presence in the community might be connected to Margaret Collins' disappearance and that his current activities might represent a continuation of the surveillance and information gathering that had preceded her departure. The review also highlighted the limitations of the original investigation and the opportunities that advances in investigative techniques and technology might provide for developing new leads in the case. Modern database systems, communication monitoring capabilities, and forensic technologies offered possibilities for investigation that had not been available in 1999. However, the passage of time had also created challenges for renewed investigation. Many of the potential witnesses from the original case were no longer available. Physical evidence had been lost or compromised, and the trail of documentation had grown cold. The success of any renewed investigation would depend largely on connecting the old case with current activities and developing new sources of information about the events of 1999. The decision was made to treat the Margaret Collins missing person case as an active investigation once again, with resources allocated to both historical research and current surveillance activities. This approach would allow the department to pursue both the mystery of Mrs. Collins' disappearance and the current concerns about surveillance activities in the community, recognizing that these two investigations might ultimately prove to be aspects of a single, larger case. Officer Kim was assigned to coordinate with state law enforcement agencies that had advanced capabilities for cold case investigation, including access to databases and analytical tools that might provide new insights into the events of 1999. This coordination would also provide additional resources for the current surveillance investigation, allowing the local department to maintain its focus on community safety while pursuing leads that extended beyond Millbrook's boundaries. The expanded investigation would require careful coordination and planning to avoid compromising either the historical research or the current surveillance activities. The goal was to develop a comprehensive understanding of both the past and present elements of the case while maintaining the security and privacy that were essential to the community's well-being. As November approached and the autumn colors reached their peak in the hills surrounding Millbrook, the police department found itself engaged in one of the most complex and potentially significant investigations in the community's recent history. The case had evolved from a simple concern about unusual behavior into a multifaceted investigation that spanned decades and involved questions about personal safety, community security, and the careful balance between privacy and protection that defined small-town life. The quiet work of investigation continued in the measured, methodical manner that had always characterized law enforcement in Millbrook, but the scope and implications of the case had expanded far beyond the routine, matters that typically occupied the department's attention. The story of Margaret Collins and Robert Thornfield was still unfolding, promising to test the skills, resources, and judgment of all those involved in protecting and serving the community. The missing person file that had gathered dust in the basement archives had become a window into questions that reached into the heart of what made Millbrook a place where people chose to build their lives, and the answers to those questions would require all the patience, wisdom, and determination that the community and its protectors could provide. The basement archives of the Millbrook police station stretched beyond the immediate storage area where current case files were maintained, extending into older sections of the building where decades of accumulated records rested in climate-controlled quiet. Chief Wells had always intended to conduct a comprehensive review and digitization of these historical documents, but the demands of daily operations had consistently postponed such projects. Now, with the Margaret Collins case reopened and new questions emerging about patterns of activity in the community, the time had come to delve deeper into the department's institutional memory. The oldest files dated back to the establishment of the police department in the 1950s, when Millbrook's growth from a rural crossroads to an incorporated town had necessitated formal law enforcement services. These early records were handwritten in careful script, documenting incidents and investigations with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized police work before the advent of modern technology and standardized reporting systems. Officer Martinez had been assigned the task of conducting a systematic review of these historical files, looking for patterns or incidents that might relate to the current investigation or provide context for understanding the community's long-term security concerns. The work was painstaking and time-consuming, requiring careful handling of fragile documents and patient deciphering of faded ink and aging paper. The earliest significant case that caught Officer Martinez's attention involved the disappearance of a traveling salesman named Harold Wickham in 1967. According to the reports, Mr. Wickham had been making regular visits to Millbrook and surrounding communities for several years, selling household goods and small appliances from his van to rural residents who had limited access to retail establishments. He had established a reliable schedule and built relationships with regular customers who looked forward to his visits and depended on his services. Mr. Wickham's disappearance had been reported when he failed to appear for scheduled appointments, and his van was found abandoned on a rural road approximately 10 miles east of Millbrook. The vehicle had been searched thoroughly, revealing his merchandise inventory intact but his personal belongings and sales records missing. No signs of struggle or violence were found, but the circumstances suggested that his departure from the vehicle had not been voluntary. Investigation conducted at the time had been extensive, involving coordination with state police agencies and searches of the surrounding rural areas. However, no trace of Mr. Wickham had ever been found, and the case had eventually been classified as a missing person investigation with an open status. The files contained photographs of the abandoned van, witness statements from customers who had expected his visits, and detailed maps showing the locations where he had been scheduled to make sales calls. What made this case particularly relevant to the current investigation was the location where Mr. Wickham's van had been discovered. The rural road where it was found abandoned was the same route that connected Millbrook to Murphy's Tavern, the establishment that Robert Thornfield visited regularly during his evening excursions. The proximity of these locations, separated by nearly 4 decades, suggested either coincidence or a pattern of activity in that particular area that warranted further investigation. Officer Martinez continued his review of the historical files, discovering additional cases that shared similar characteristics or geographic connections. In 1973, a young woman named Susan Morrison had disappeared while driving home from her job at a factory in the neighboring county. Her car had been found parked at the side of County Road 15, approximately 3 miles from Murphy's Tavern, with no signs of mechanical problems or evidence of an accident. Susan Morrison had been described by family and friends as a responsible and cautious person who would not have abandoned her vehicle without good reason. The investigation had revealed that she had followed her usual route home from work and had been expected by her family at a specific time. Her failure to arrive home had prompted an immediate search, but no trace of her had been found despite extensive efforts involving local volunteers and law enforcement agencies. The case had remained active for several years, with periodic reviews and follow-up investigations, as new techniques became available or potential leads were developed. However, like the Harold Wickham case, it had eventually been classified as a cold case with an open status. That allowed for renewed investigation if circumstances warranted. A third case from the historical files involved the 1985 disappearance of an elderly farmer named Thomas Bradley, who had lived alone on a property that bordered the rural area where the previous disappearances had occurred. Mr. Bradley had been reported missing when he failed to appear at the weekly farmers market where he had sold produce regularly for over 20 years. A search of his property had revealed that his truck was missing, along with personal items that suggested he had left voluntarily. However, the investigation had uncovered circumstances that raised questions about whether his departure had been entirely by choice. Neighbors reported that Mr. Bradley had seemed anxious and distracted in the weeks preceding his disappearance, mentioning concerns about strangers who had been observed on or near his property. He had also made inquiries about selling his farm, despite previously expressing strong attachment to the land that had been in his family for generations. Mr. Bradley's truck had been found several weeks later in a parking lot near a bus station in a city 200 miles away, but no records of him purchasing bus tickets or using other transportation services had been located. His bank accounts had remained untouched, and no trace of his activities after leaving Millbrook had ever been discovered. The review of these historical cases revealed a pattern of disappearances that had occurred at irregular intervals over several decades, all involving individuals who had some connection to the rural areas surrounding Millbrook. The victims had included people of different ages, backgrounds, and circumstances, but they shared certain characteristics that might have made them vulnerable to predatory behavior or useful to someone. Conducting long-term surveillance or intelligence gathering operations. Harold Wickham, the traveling salesman, would have possessed detailed knowledge of rural residents' routines, financial circumstances, and security arrangements based on his regular visits to their homes. Susan Morrison had worked at a factory that employed many residents of the area, giving her access to information about work schedules and family circumstances. Thomas Bradley had lived alone on isolated property that would have provided ideal conditions for activities requiring privacy and security. From observation, Officer Martinez compiled his findings into a comprehensive report that documented the similarities and connections between these historical cases and the current investigation. The geographic pattern was particularly striking, with all of the disappearances occurring in areas that were accessible from the routes that Robert Thornfield used during his evening excursions to Murphy's Tavern. Chief Wells reviewed Officer Martinez's report while considering the implications of these historical patterns for the current investigation. The discovery of multiple unsolved disappearances spanning several decades suggested that Millbrook might have been the focus of predatory activity over an extended period, possibly involving multiple perpetrators or a single individual or organization with long-term objectives in the area. The possibility that these historical disappearances might be connected to Margaret Collins' case and Robert Thornfield's current activities required careful analysis and coordination with state law enforcement agencies that had resources for investigating complex criminal patterns. Chief Wells contacted the State Police Cold Case Unit to discuss the potential connections and request assistance in conducting a comprehensive review of all related cases. The response from the state police was immediate and supportive, reflecting their recognition of the potential significance of the patterns that had been identified. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chun from the Cold Case Unit arranged to visit Millbrook within the week to review the files and assess the resources that would be needed for a comprehensive investigation of the historical cases and their potential connections to current activities. While awaiting the arrival of state investigators, Chief Wells assigned Officer Kim to conduct additional research into property records and land transactions in the rural areas where the disappearances had occurred. This research would help identify any patterns in property, ownership, or development that might be connected to the disappearances or provide insight into potential motives for the criminal activity. Property records research revealed several interesting patterns that had not been apparent from the criminal investigation files alone. Over the decade since the first disappearances had occurred, several properties in the affected rural areas had changed ownership under circumstances that shared similarities with Margaret Collins' sale of her Cedar Lane house. In each case, the sales had occurred more quickly than was typical for rural property transactions, with minimal negotiation over price or terms and limited direct involvement of the sellers in the process. Several of the transactions had involved intermediaries or property management companies that had handled the negotiations and paperwork on behalf of the actual buyers, creating a layer of separation between the sellers and the ultimate purchasers of their properties. Most significantly, several of the properties had been purchased by individuals or entities that had limited connection to the local area and no apparent need for rural land for farming, development, or other traditional purposes. The buyers had typically taken possession of the properties quietly, without the sort of community integration that usually accompanied new residents in rural areas. Officer Kim's research also revealed that some of these properties had been sold again after relatively short periods of ownership, often to different buyers who also maintained low profiles in the community. This pattern of rapid turnover suggested that the properties might have been acquired for temporary use rather than long-term ownership, possibly serving as staging areas or safe houses for activities that required privacy and isolation from community observation. Timing of some of these property transactions corresponded with periods when disappearances had occurred in the area, suggesting potential connections between property acquisition and criminal activity. However, the connections were circumstantial and would require more detailed investigation to establish whether they represented evidence of criminal conspiracy or coincidental real estate activity. Detective Lieutenant Chun arrived in Millbrook on a crisp November morning, bringing with her the resources and expertise of the State Police Cold Case Unit. Her first meeting with Chief Wells and the local officers took place in the department's conference room, where the historical files had been organized for review and the connections between cases had been mapped on large charts that covered the walls. Detective Chun's initial assessment of the case materials was thorough and systematic, reflecting years of experience in analyzing complex criminal patterns and cold case investigations. She examined each file carefully, noting similarities in the circumstances of the disappearances and the geographic patterns that connected them. Her questions were precise and focused, designed to identify the most promising leads for further investigation. The state detective's analysis confirmed many of the connections that the local officers had identified, while also highlighting additional patterns that had not been immediately apparent. She noted that the intervals between disappearances followed a rough pattern that might suggest either opportunistic criminal activity or systematic operations conducted according to specific schedules or criteria. Detective Chun also brought access to state and federal databases that might contain information relevant to the historical cases. Her preliminary searches revealed that similar patterns of disappearances had been reported in other rural communities across the region, though the connections had not been identified previously due to the jurisdictional boundaries that separated local law enforcement agencies. The possibility that Millbrook's disappearances might be part of a broader pattern of criminal activity across multiple jurisdictions elevated the significance of the investigation and the resources that would be allocated to it. Detective Chun explained that federal agencies might become involved if evidence of interstate criminal activity was developed, bringing additional investigative capabilities and legal authorities to bear on the case. However, she also emphasized the importance of maintaining the careful, methodical approach that the local department had taken in developing the case. The strength of any eventual prosecution would depend on the quality of the evidence and the thoroughness of the investigation, qualities that could not be rushed or compromised by external pressure. For rapid results, the collaborative investigation that emerged from this meeting combined the local knowledge and community connections of the Millbrook officers with the specialized expertise and resources of the State Police Cold Case Unit. Detective Chun would coordinate the historical investigation while Chief Wells and her officers continued monitoring current activities and maintaining community safety. The investigation plan included systematic reviews of all related files, interviews with surviving witnesses from the historical cases, coordination with other jurisdictions that might have experienced similar disappearances, and continued surveillance of current activities that might be connected to the historical pattern. Officer Martinez was assigned to work directly with Detective Chun on the historical file review, while Officer Kim would continue her property records research with assistance from state investigators who had access to more comprehensive databases. Chief Wells would coordinate overall operations and maintain communication with community members who might have relevant information or concerns. The expanded investigation also included plans for forensic examination of the locations where vehicles had been abandoned in the historical cases, using modern techniques that might reveal evidence not detectable with the technology available at the time of the original investigations. Ground-penetrating radar and other advanced search methods would be employed to examine areas where human remains might be concealed. As the investigation moved into its new phase, the quiet work of examining old files and documents continued in the basement archives of the police station. The historical records that had gathered dust for decades were now central to understanding a pattern of criminal activity that might have affected the community for generations. The archives yielded additional details that had been overlooked or underemphasized in the original investigations. Witness statements contained descriptions of unfamiliar vehicles and individuals that, when viewed collectively across multiple cases, suggested surveillance and reconnaissance activities similar to those currently being observed in Millbrook. Several witnesses from the historical cases had reported seeing the same vehicles or individuals in connection with multiple disappearances, though the significance of these connections had not been recognized at the time. The vehicles were typically described as dark sedans or vans, well-maintained but unremarkable, driven by individuals who avoided direct contact with local residents but seemed to be conducting systematic observations of the area. These descriptions were remarkably consistent with the current observations of surveillance activities around Millbrook, suggesting either continuity in criminal operations or the involvement of individuals or organizations with consistent methods and equipment. The possibility that the same perpetrators might be responsible for both historical and current activities was sobering, implying a level of organization and persistence that would require extraordinary investigative efforts to counter. The review of archived files also revealed that several of the historical cases had generated tips and leads that had not been fully investigated due to resource limitations or jurisdictional constraints. Some of these leads involved reports of suspicious activities in remote rural areas, descriptions of unusual vehicles or individuals, and accounts of encounters with people who seemed to be conducting surveillance or reconnaissance. Detective Chun's analysis of these historical leads suggested that several warranted renewed investigation with modern techniques and resources. Phone numbers, license plate numbers, and physical descriptions that had been recorded decades ago could now be analyzed using computer databases and investigative tools that had not existed at the time of the original cases. The process of following up on these historical leads would be time-consuming and might not yield immediate results, but it represented the sort of systematic investigation that had solved many cold cases when new technology or techniques were applied to old evidence. The commitment to pursuing every possible lead reflected the seriousness with which both local and state investigators viewed the potential connections between historical and current cases. As November progressed and the investigation expanded, the archives of the Millbrook Police Station continued to yield insights into the community's long relationship with mysterious disappearances and unexplained activities. The quiet work of reviewing old files and documents had become a window into decades of questions that had never been fully answered, patterns that had never been completely understood, and concerns that had never been completely resolved. The echoes of past cases resonated with current investigations, creating a complex tapestry of evidence and suspicion that challenged the investigators to think beyond traditional boundaries of time and jurisdiction. The story of Millbrook's missing persons was still being written, and the archives held clues that might finally provide the answers that had eluded investigators for generations. Asterisk. The Millbrook River wound through the valley like a silver thread, carrying the waters of distant hills past the town and into the broader streams that eventually reached the sea. For generations, the river had defined the community's eastern boundary, providing a natural barrier that separated the developed areas from the wilder country beyond. Its banks were lined with ancient willows and cottonwoods that created shadowed corridors, where the water moved slowly through pools and eddies that had carved themselves into the landscape over countless seasons. Detective Lieutenant Chun had requested a comprehensive survey of all locations in and around Millbrook where criminal activities might be conducted without detection, recognizing that understanding the geography of concealment was essential to solving cases that had puzzled investigators for decades. The river and its associated features represented the most significant of these hidden places, offering isolation, natural barriers to observation, and potential sites for activities that required absolute privacy. Officer Kim had grown up in Millbrook and possessed intimate knowledge of the rivers, moods and secrets accumulated through childhood explorations and adult recreational activities. Her assignment to survey the waterway and document its potential significance to the investigation drew upon this local expertise while applying the systematic approach that the expanded investigation demanded. The river's course through the Millbrook area included several features that were particularly relevant to the investigation. Approximately 2 miles upstream from the town center, the water passed under an old railroad trestle that had been built in the 1940s to carry freight trains serving the agricultural areas to the west. The trestle was constructed of heavy timber and steel, creating a substantial bridge that cast deep shadows over the water and provided shelter from aerial observation. The area around the railroad trestle had been a popular fishing and swimming spot for local residents for many years, but its use had declined as concerns about safety and liability had led to restrictions on public access. The railroad company had installed fencing and posted warning signs, though these barriers were not comprehensive enough to prevent determined individuals from reaching the water or the shelter provided by the bridge structure. Officer Kim's survey of the trestle area revealed evidence of recent human activity that was not consistent with casual, recreational use or authorized railroad maintenance. Tire tracks in the soft earth near the water indicated that vehicles had been driven to locations that were not accessible by established roads or paths. The tracks appeared relatively fresh, suggesting activity within the past several weeks, though the specific timing was difficult to determine due to recent rainfall and changing weather conditions. More significantly, Officer Kim discovered what appeared to be a carefully concealed storage cache hidden among the timber supports of the trestle structure. The cache consisted of several metal containers that had been painted to blend with the weathered wood and steel of the bridge, making them nearly invisible to casual observation. The containers were secured with heavy locks and showed signs of regular use, though they had been positioned to avoid detection during routine railroad inspections or maintenance. Activities. The discovery of this hidden storage site was immediately reported to Detective Chun and Chief Wells, prompting an urgent meeting to determine the appropriate response to this potentially significant development. The containers could contain evidence related to the historical disappearances, materials connected to current surveillance activities, or items that might pose a threat to community safety if they were not properly secured and examined. The decision was made to conduct a careful examination of the storage cache using proper forensic procedures that would preserve any evidence while ensuring the safety of the investigating officers. Detective Chun coordinated with state police forensic specialists who had experience with potentially dangerous or sensitive materials, while Chief Wells arranged for the area to be secured and protected from contamination or interference. The forensic examination of the hidden containers was conducted on a gray November afternoon, with the river running high and dark beneath the railroad trestle as specialized officers worked methodically to document and preserve whatever evidence the cache might contain. The first container yielded surveillance equipment, including cameras, recording devices, and communication equipment that appeared to be of professional quality and recent manufacture. The equipment was sophisticated and expensive, far beyond what would typically be used by amateur enthusiasts or casual observers. The cameras were equipped with telephoto lenses and low-light capabilities that would allow detailed observation and recording of activities at considerable distances and under challenging lighting conditions. The recording devices were digital and had substantial memory capacity, suggesting they had been used for extended surveillance operations. More disturbing was the discovery that several of the devices contained recorded material that appeared to document the daily routines and activities of Millbrook residents over an extended period. The recordings included detailed observations of individuals going about their normal activities, apparently unaware that they were being systematically monitored and documented by unknown observers. The second container held what appeared to be detailed maps and diagrams of Millbrook and surrounding areas, including information about property layouts, security systems, and the personal schedules of various residents. The maps were professionally prepared and included details that would require extensive surveillance and reconnaissance to compile, confirming the systematic nature of the information gathering that had been suspected based on other evidence. The maps also included marked locations that corresponded to sites where historical disappearances had occurred, suggesting connections between the current surveillance activities and the unsolved cases that stretched back decades. Red marks indicated properties that had changed ownership under suspicious circumstances, while blue marks showed locations where unusual activities had been reported by residents or observed by police officers. The third container contained personal effects and documentation that appeared to belong to individuals who had disappeared from the area over the years. Items included identification documents, personal jewelry, and photographs that family members had reported missing along with their loved ones. The presence of these materials in the hidden cache provided the first direct evidence linking current activities to the historical disappearances. Detective Chun photographed and cataloged each item carefully, recognizing that these materials might provide crucial evidence for solving cases that had remained unsolved for decades. The personal effects would need to be compared with missing person reports and family accounts to establish definitive connections, but the initial examination suggested that the cache contained evidence from multiple cases spanning many years. The discovery at the railroad trestle prompted an expanded search of other locations along the river where similar caches might be concealed. Officer Kim led teams of investigators to areas where her local knowledge suggested that storage sites could be established without detection, focusing on locations that offered natural concealment and easy access for individuals familiar with the terrain. The search efforts were conducted methodically, using both visual inspection and ground-penetrating radar to identify potential hiding places among the dense vegetation and complex topography that characterized the river corridor. The work was slow and careful, recognizing that additional caches might contain evidence that was crucial to solving the investigation, or materials that could pose risks to public safety if disturbed improperly. A second cache was discovered approximately 1 mile downstream from the railroad trestle, hidden among the root system of a massive oak tree that had been growing on the riverbank for over a century. This location was even more secluded than the trestle site, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through heavy brush and required considerable local knowledge to navigate successfully. Downstream cache contained different types of materials, including what appeared to be detailed financial records and documentation related to property transactions in the Millbrook area. The records included information about bank accounts, real estate transfers, and business relationships that were not part of the public record and would have required insider access or sophisticated intelligence gathering to compile. These financial documents provided insight into the potential motives behind the surveillance activities and historical disappearances. The record suggested that substantial amounts of money had been generated through property acquisitions and transfers over the years, with profits that appeared to be derived from forcing or coercing residents to sell valuable real estate at below market prices. The documentation also revealed connections between various property transactions and individuals who had subsequently disappeared, suggesting that the disappearances might have been motivated by efforts to eliminate witnesses to financial crimes or to silence individuals who pose threats to ongoing criminal operations. The systematic nature of these activities indicated organization and planning that extended far beyond opportunistic criminal behavior. Officer Martinez was assigned to coordinate with the railroad company to examine their maintenance and inspection records for the trestle area, seeking information about any unauthorized activities or security concerns that might have been noted over the years. The railroad officials were cooperative and provided access to their files, though the records revealed only routine maintenance activities and occasional reports of trespassing that had not been investigated thoroughly at the time. However, the railroad records did include several reports from train crews who had observed unusual activities near the trestle during nighttime operations. These reports described vehicles and individuals in areas where such activity was unusual, though the reports had been filed as routine observations rather than security concerns requiring investigation. Timing of some of these railroad observations corresponded with periods when disappearances had occurred, providing additional circumstantial evidence linking the trestle area to the historical cases. The train crews had noted that the unusual activities often involved multiple vehicles and appeared to be coordinated operations rather than casual trespassing or recreational activities. Detective Chun's analysis of all the evidence recovered from the river sites began to reveal the scope and complexity of the criminal operation that had apparently been using Millbrook as a base for decades. The combination of surveillance equipment, personal effects from missing persons, financial records, and property documentation suggested a sophisticated organization that had been systematically targeting rural communities for various forms of criminal activity. The investigation also revealed that the railway station in Millbrook, which had been largely abandoned since passenger service ended in the 1980s, might have played a role in the criminal activities. The old station building and associated structures provided additional locations for concealment and storage, while the remaining freight operations offered potential means for transporting people and materials without detection. Officer Kim conducted a survey of the abandoned railway facilities, discovering that several buildings showed signs of recent use despite their official status as unused and unsecured structures. Windows that had been boarded up for years showed evidence of having been opened and resealed, while interior spaces contained indications that they had been occupied or used for storage purposes. The railway station investigation revealed that the old freight platform and loading areas had been used recently for activities that required the movement of heavy materials or equipment. Marks on the concrete platform and wear patterns in the surrounding gravel indicated that vehicles had been loaded or unloaded at the site, though no records of such activities existed in the railroad companies. Operational files. The discovery of this additional site expanded the geographic scope of the criminal operation and provided insight into how materials and possibly individuals might have been transported into and out of the Millbrook area without detection. The railway facilities offered direct connections to transportation networks that could reach anywhere in the region, providing opportunities for criminal activities that extended far beyond the local community. Chief Wells coordinated with federal transportation security authorities to examine the railroad company's records for any patterns of unusual freight movements or security incidents that might be connected to the Millbrook investigation. This coordination revealed that similar concerns had been raised at other locations along the railroad network, suggesting that the criminal operation might be using multiple sites across a broad geographic area. The federal involvement also brought additional resources and expertise to the investigation, including specialized units that had experience with organized criminal activities involving transportation networks and rural communities. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond what local and state agencies could handle independently. requiring coordination with federal authorities who had jurisdiction over interstate criminal activities. As the investigation of hidden places continued, additional sites were identified where evidence of criminal activity was discovered. An abandoned quarry approximately 5 miles from Millbrook yielded buried containers with additional surveillance, equipment, and documentation. A remote farm building that had been unused for years contained evidence of recent occupation and materials that suggested it had been used as a staging area for criminal operations. Each new discovery added to the growing picture of a criminal organization that had been operating in the Millbrook area for decades, using the region's isolation and the community's trusting nature to conduct activities that required secrecy and security from law enforcement detection. The organization appeared to have sophisticated methods for surveillance, communication, and coordination that allowed it to operate effectively across multiple locations and over extended periods. The investigation also revealed that the criminal activities were not limited to disappearances and property fraud, but included other forms of criminal enterprise that generated substantial profits while maintaining low profiles in the affected communities. The evidence suggested money laundering, illegal transportation of goods and people, and other activities that required the sort of infrastructure and security that the hidden sites provided. Detective Chien's coordination with federal authorities resulted in the assignment of additional investigators and resources to the Millbrook case, recognizing its potential significance as a window into broader criminal activities that affected multiple states and communities. The investigation was classified as a major federal case with priority status for resource allocation and interagency coordination. Expansion of the investigation brought both opportunities and challenges for the local law enforcement agencies that had initiated the case. While additional resources and expertise were welcome, the increased federal involvement also meant that local control over the investigation would be reduced, and that community concerns about privacy and disruption would need to be balanced against federal law enforcement priorities. Chief Wells worked to ensure that local interests and community safety remained central considerations in the expanded investigation, while recognizing that the scope of the criminal activities required resources and authorities that were beyond the capabilities of local agencies. The balance between federal efficiency and local sensitivity would require careful coordination and communication among all the agencies involved. As winter approached and the investigation of hidden places continued, the river valley around Millbrook revealed more of its secrets to the patient work of investigators who understood that decades of criminal activity would not yield their evidence easily. The hidden caches, abandoned buildings, and remote sites that had concealed evidence for years were gradually surrendering their contents to systematic searches and forensic examination. Story of Millbrook's hidden places was becoming clear as a deliberately constructed network of concealment and criminal infrastructure that had allowed sophisticated criminal operations to flourish in the apparent peace and security of rural valley life. The investigation continued with the methodical determination that such complex cases required, guided by the understanding that the community's safety and the resolution of decades-old mysteries depended on revealing all the secrets that the landscape had been forced to keep. The genealogical records housed in the Millbrook Public Library had been collected over decades through the patient work of local historians and family researchers who understood that small communities were defined as much by their ancestral connections as by their current residents. These carefully preserved documents, photographs, and family trees now became crucial resources for understanding the deeper patterns that had shaped the criminal activities uncovered in the expanding investigation. Detective Chun had recognized that the sophisticated nature of the criminal operation suggested knowledge of the community that extended beyond casual observation or recent reconnaissance. The detailed information about residents' routines, property values, and family circumstances, indicated access to historical records and personal relationships that could only be developed over extended periods or through insider connections to the community's social fabric. The task of examining these family histories fell to Officer Kim, whose own roots in Millbrook provided her with understanding of the complex relationships and long-standing connections that characterized life in the valley. Her assignment was to identify patterns in the family backgrounds of missing persons and property fraud victims that might explain why they had been targeted, or reveal connections to individuals who might have facilitated the criminal activities. The process began with Margaret Collins, whose disappearance had initiated the current phase of the investigation. The library's genealogical collection contained extensive documentation of the Collins family's history in the area, stretching back to the early settlement period when Margaret's great-grandfather had established a farm in the valley. During the early 1890s, the family had been prominent in local affairs for several generations, with members serving in various civic roles and maintaining extensive social connections throughout the community. Margaret Collins herself had been born in Millbrook and had remained connected to the community throughout her life, even during a brief period in her 20s when she had lived in a larger city while working as a teacher. Her return to Millbrook following her marriage had been viewed as natural by residents who understood the strong pull that the valley exerted on those who had grown up among its hills and streams. The Collins family history revealed several details that were relevant to understanding Margaret's eventual fate. Her property on Cedar Lane had been in the family for over 60 years, inherited from her parents and maintained as a link to the community's agricultural heritage even after the surrounding area had been developed for residential use. The property's value had increased substantially over the decades, making it an attractive target for individuals seeking valuable real estate at below market prices. More significantly, Margaret's family connections included relationships with several other families, whose members had also been victims of suspicious disappearances or property transactions over the years. The genealogical records showed that Harold Wickham, the traveling salesman who had disappeared in 1967, had been related to Margaret Collins through his grandmother, who had been Margaret's great-aunt. This family connection had not been recognized during the original investigation of Wickham's disappearance, but it suggested that family relationships might have played a role in targeting decisions. Officer Kim's research revealed similar connections between other victims of suspicious disappearances. Susan Morrison, who had vanished in 1973, had been a distant cousin of Thomas Bradley, the farmer who had disappeared in 1985. The family connection was remote enough that it might not have been known to the victims themselves, but it indicated a pattern of targeting that was based on detailed knowledge of genealogical relationships that extended beyond casual community awareness. The pattern became more apparent as Officer Kim mapped the family connections among all the individuals who had disappeared or been victimized by suspicious property transactions over the decades. Nearly all of the victims shared ancestral connections to families who had owned significant amounts of land in the valley during the early settlement period, and many were descended from individuals who had established successful businesses or accumulated substantial wealth during Millbrook's development as a community. These family histories suggested that the criminal operation had been specifically targeting descendants of the valley's founding families, possibly because their property holdings were particularly valuable or because their family connections made them sources of information about other potential victims. The systematic nature of this targeting indicated advanced research and planning that required access to detailed genealogical records and deep understanding of local family relationships. The genealogical research also revealed connections between some of the victims and individuals who had remained in the community and might have had access to the sort of inside information that would have been useful to criminal operators. Several families had members who worked in positions that provided access to personal and financial information about other residents, including employment at the bank, the courthouse, the real estate office, and other institutions that maintained records of local activities. Officer Kim's investigation of these potential inside connections focused on identifying individuals who had both access to useful information and family relationships to the victims of criminal activities. The process required careful attention to privacy concerns and legal limitations on investigating individuals who had not been directly connected to criminal activities, but it was essential to understanding how the criminal operation had obtained the detailed information that its activities required. One particularly significant discovery involved the family history of Robert Thornfield himself, whose background had been investigated only superficially when he first moved to Millbrook. The genealogical records revealed that Thornfield's maternal grandmother had been born in the valley and had lived there during her childhood before moving away as a young woman. This connection meant that Thornfield had ancestral ties to the community that he had not disclosed when he purchased Margaret Collins' property. The discovery of Thornfield's hidden family connection to Millbrook provided a new perspective on his activities and motivations. His systematic surveillance and information gathering might have been motivated by personal or family reasons related to his grandmother's history in the valley, or his genealogical connection might have made him a valuable asset to criminal operators who needed someone with legitimate reasons for residing in the community. Further, research into Thornfield's family history revealed that his grandmother had been involved in a controversial property dispute during the 1940s, when her family's farm had been sold under circumstances that had generated significant community discussion at the time. The dispute had involved allegations of fraud and coercion similar to those that had characterized the suspicious property transactions of recent decades, suggesting that the current criminal activities might have roots that extended back to previous generations. The genealogical investigation also uncovered information about other individuals who had moved to Millbrook in recent years and established themselves as residents while maintaining low profiles in the community. Several of these newcomers had family connections to the valley that they had not disclosed, and some had acquired property under circumstances that shared characteristics with the suspicious transactions that had been identified in the investigation. Detective Chen's analysis of these family history patterns suggested that the criminal operation had been using genealogical research to identify both potential victims and potential operatives who could be recruited or coerced into supporting criminal activities. The systematic nature of this approach indicated sophisticated planning and resources that extended far beyond typical criminal organizations. The investigation of family histories also revealed the existence of detailed records that had been maintained by unknown individuals who appeared to have been conducting genealogical research specifically for the purpose of identifying targets and opportunities for criminal activities. These records had been discovered among the materials recovered from the hidden caches along the river, and they contained information that went far beyond what was available in public sources or library collections. The private genealogical records included detailed family trees, property ownership histories, and personal information about residents that could only have been compiled through extensive surveillance and inside access to private records. The documents showed evidence of having been maintained over many years, with regular updates and additions that reflected changes in family circumstances and property ownership. Officer Kim worked with Detective Chun to analyze these private genealogical records and compare them with the official records maintained by the library and courthouse. The comparison revealed that the criminal operation had access to information that was not available through public sources, suggesting either sophisticated intelligence gathering capabilities or cooperation from individuals who had legitimate access to private records. The analysis also showed that the criminal operation had been targeting families based on specific criteria that combined genealogical connections, property ownership, and personal circumstances that made individuals vulnerable to coercion or elimination. The targeting decisions appeared to be based on detailed analysis of family relationships and financial circumstances that required considerable research and planning. One of the most disturbing discoveries in the private genealogical records was evidence that the criminal operation had been monitoring and documenting the family relationships of law enforcement, officers, and other local officials who might pose threats to their activities. The records included detailed information about the families of Chief Wells and her officers, suggesting that they had been under surveillance for extended periods. This revelation raised serious concerns about the safety of law enforcement personnel and their families, prompting immediate security measures and coordination with federal authorities, who had experience protecting witnesses and officials involved in dangerous investigations. The discovery that the criminal operation had been specifically monitoring law enforcement families indicated a level of sophistication and ruthlessness that elevated the threat level of the entire investigation. Detective Chun's coordination with federal behavioral analysis specialists revealed that the systematic targeting of genealogically connected families was consistent with organized criminal activities that had been observed in other regions. The use of family history research to identify victims and operatives was a sophisticated technique that required considerable resources and planning, suggesting connections to larger criminal organizations with national or international scope. The behavioral analysis also suggested that the criminal operation in Millbrook might be part of a broader pattern of activities that targeted rural communities with specific demographic and genealogical characteristics. The use of ancestral connections and family relationships as criteria for targeting indicated cultural or regional knowledge that might be based on ethnic or historical factors that were not immediately apparent to outside observers. Officer Martinez was assigned to coordinate with federal investigators who were examining similar cases in other rural communities, seeking patterns that might indicate coordinated criminal activities across multiple jurisdictions. This coordination revealed that several other communities had experienced similar patterns of disappearances and property fraud, with victims who shared genealogical characteristics similar to those identified in Millbrook. The multi-jurisdictional investigation revealed that the criminal operation appeared to be targeting communities that had been settled by specific ethnic or cultural groups. During the westward expansion of the 19th century, the targeting seemed to focus on descendants of families who had accumulated land and wealth during the early settlement period, particularly those whose current circumstances made them vulnerable to coercion or elimination. This discovery provided new insights into the motives and scope of the criminal operation, suggesting that it might be motivated by historical grievances or cultural conflicts that extended beyond simple financial gain. The systematic nature of the genealogical research and targeting indicated ideological motivations that added complexity to understanding the criminal organization and its ultimate objectives. The investigation of family histories also revealed that several residents of Millbrook had been approached over the years by individuals claiming to be genealogical researchers or family historians who sought information about local families and their histories. These contacts had seemed legitimate at the time and had been viewed as natural interest in local history, but they now appeared to be part of the criminal operations intelligence gathering activities. Officer Kim interviewed residents who remembered these contacts, gathering descriptions of the individuals and details about the information they had sought. The interviews revealed that the supposed researchers had been particularly interested in information about property ownership, family relationships, and personal circumstances that were not typically part of genealogical research, suggesting that their true purposes had been criminal rather than academic. the descriptions provided by residents were consistent with some of the individuals who had been observed conducting surveillance activities in recent months, suggesting that the criminal operation had been using genealogical research as a cover for intelligence gathering for many years. This technique had allowed them to obtain detailed information about potential victims while maintaining the appearance of legitimate scholarly activity. Chief Wells coordinated with the Library and Historical Society to review their records of researchers who had accessed genealogical materials over the years, seeking patterns that might identify criminal operatives or reveal the scope of their intelligence gathering activities. This review revealed that several individuals had made extensive use of the genealogical collections while providing false or minimal identification information. The library records also showed that some researchers had attempted to access restricted materials or had asked questions about specific families that were not consistent with typical genealogical research. These incidents had been noted by librarians at the time, but had not been reported to law enforcement because they had not been recognized as potentially criminal activities. As the investigation of family histories continued through the early winter months, the scope and sophistication of the criminal operation became increasingly apparent. The systematic use of genealogical research to identify targets and gather intelligence represented a level of planning and organization that extended far beyond typical criminal activities, requiring coordination among multiple individuals and access to resources that suggested connections to larger criminal organizations. The family history investigation also revealed the deeply personal nature of the crimes that had affected Millbrook over the decades. The targeting of specific families based on their ancestral connections to the community represented not just financial crimes but attacks on the social fabric and cultural heritage that defined the valley's identity as a place where families had built their lives across generations. Detective Chun's analysis of all the genealogical evidence suggested that the criminal operation had been engaged in what amounted to cultural warfare against the founding families of Millbrook and similar communities, using sophisticated research and planning to systematically eliminate or displace the descendants of the valley's original settlers. This interpretation added ideological dimensions to the investigation that required coordination with federal authorities who had experience with hate crimes and domestic terrorism. The investigation of family histories had revealed patterns of targeting and victimization that extended far beyond simple criminal opportunism, suggesting that the residents of Millbrook had been caught up in conflicts and grievances that reached back to the historical settlement of the region. Understanding these deeper motivations would be essential to preventing future victimization and ensuring that justice was served for the crimes that had been committed over the coffin decades. As winter settled over the valley and the investigation continued its methodical progress, the family histories of Millbrook's residents provided a window into the complex motivations and systematic planning that had characterized decades of criminal activity in the community. The genealogical records that had been preserved to honor the community's heritage had become evidence in an investigation that revealed how that heritage had been systematically targeted for destruction by individuals who understood its value and were determined to claim it for themselves. The daily rhythm of police work in Millbrook had always been measured by the steady accumulation of reports, observations, and documented incidents that formed a continuous record of community life. Now, with the investigation expanding into federal territory and revealing patterns that stretched back decades, this routine paperwork had taken on new significance as potential evidence in a case that grew more complex with each passing day. Detective Chun had established a systematic approach to reviewing every incident report, patrol log, and administrative document that had been generated by the Millbrook Police Department over the past 20 years. The process required patience and attention to detail, that could easily be overlooked in the urgency of pursuing more dramatic leads. But she understood that the foundation of successful complex investigations was built on the careful analysis of mundane records that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation. Asterisk. Officer Martinez had been assigned to coordinate this comprehensive review, working methodically through filing cabinets and computer records that documented thousands of routine interactions between law enforcement and community members. Each report was examined, not only for its immediate content, but also for its potential connections to other incidents and its place in the broader timeline of suspicious activities that had been identified through the investigation. The process revealed immediately that the volume of routine reports generated by the Millbrook Police Department had been remarkably consistent over the years, reflecting the stable nature of community life and the department's commitment to documenting even minor incidents that might seem insignificant at the time. This consistency made it easier to identify patterns and anomalies that might indicate criminal activity or surveillance operations conducted by unknown individuals. One of the first patterns to emerge from the systematic review involved reports of suspicious vehicles observed in various neighborhoods over extended periods. While individual reports of unfamiliar cars or trucks had been filed as routine observations, the collective analysis revealed that certain vehicles had been reported multiple times in different locations, suggesting systematic surveillance activities that had been conducted over months or years. The vehicle descriptions were often incomplete or inconsistent, as was natural for reports filed by residents who had not expected their observations to become part of criminal investigations. However, certain characteristics appeared repeatedly in the reports, including dark-colored sedans with tinted windows, panel vans with no identifying markings, and pickup trucks with covered beds that concealed their contents from observation. Officer Martinez created detailed charts, mapping the locations and dates of these vehicle sightings, revealing patterns of movement and concentration that corresponded with areas where suspicious activities had been identified through other aspects of the investigation. The vehicles appeared to have been conducting systematic surveillance of residential neighborhoods, with particular attention to properties owned by families with genealogical connections to the community's founding settlers. The timing of these vehicle sightings also revealed significant patterns that had not been apparent when the reports were filed individually. Clusters of sightings often preceded disappearances or suspicious property transactions by several weeks or months, suggesting that the criminal operation had been conducting extensive surveillance before taking action against specific targets. More disturbing was the discovery that some of these surveillance vehicles had been observed near the homes of law enforcement officers and their families, particularly during periods when the officers were involved in investigating suspicious activities or following up on community concerns. This pattern suggested that the criminal operation had been monitoring police activities and potentially planning countermeasures against law enforcement efforts. Detective Chun's analysis of these surveillance patterns revealed a level of sophistication that indicated professional training and experience in intelligence gathering operations. The systematic approach to target selection, the careful timing of surveillance activities, and the coordination required to maintain long-term observation operations suggested connections to individuals or organizations with military or law enforcement backgrounds. Review of patrol logs provided another perspective on the criminal activities that had been occurring in and around Millbrook over the years. Officers conducting routine patrols had documented numerous observations of unusual activities that had not been investigated thoroughly at the time because they had not been recognized as potentially connected to criminal operations. These patrol observations included reports of individuals walking through neighborhoods at unusual hours, people photographing properties without apparent legitimate purposes, and vehicles parked in locations that provided observation points for residential or commercial areas. The individual incidents had been noted as routine observations, but their collective analysis revealed patterns of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering that had been conducted systematically over extended periods. Officer Kim's analysis of the patrol logs also revealed that several officers had reported feeling that they were being watched or followed during their shifts, particularly when they were investigating reports of suspicious activities or conducting welfare checks on elderly residents. These reports had been filed as routine observations about community awareness of police activities, but they now appeared to indicate that law enforcement officers had been under surveillance by the criminal organization. Systematic review also uncovered administrative records that revealed attempts by unknown individuals to obtain information about police operations and community members through various official and unofficial channels. These attempts had included requests for public records, inquiries about police procedures, and approaches to civilian employees of the department seeking information about scheduling and operations. Most of these information gathering attempts had been handled according to established procedures for responding to public records requests or general inquiries about police operations. However, the collective analysis revealed that the inquiries had been more systematic and focused than was typical for legitimate public interest, suggesting that they were part of organized intelligence gathering operations. The records review also revealed that several individuals had attempted to establish relationships with police department employees, offering social interactions or business relationships that would have provided access to inside information about law enforcement activities. These approaches had been subtle and appeared legitimate at the time, but they now seem to be part of systematic efforts to penetrate law enforcement security. Detective Shun coordinated with federal investigators who specialized in analyzing organized criminal intelligence operations, seeking their expertise in understanding the patterns and techniques that had been revealed through the records review. The federal analysis confirmed that the approaches and methods documented in the Millbrook records were consistent with sophisticated, organized crime operations that had been observed in other regions. The federal investigators also provided resources for analyzing the timing and coordination of the various criminal activities that had been documented over the years. This analysis revealed that the operations in Millbrook appeared to be part of a larger pattern of activities that had been conducted in multiple communities across several states, with timing and methods that suggested central coordination and planning. Officer Martinez was assigned to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in communities where similar patterns had been identified, sharing information and seeking insights that might help solve the Millbrook cases while contributing to broader understanding of the criminal organization's methods and scope. This interjurisdictional coordination revealed that the patient work of reviewing routine records and incident reports had been crucial to identifying criminal activities in other communities as well. The systematic approach to analyzing seemingly unrelated incidents had provided the foundation for understanding complex criminal operations that would have remained hidden if investigators had focused only on major crimes or dramatic incidents. Records review also provided insights into the personal costs that the criminal activities had imposed on community members over the years. Residents who had filed reports about suspicious activities or expressed concerns about unusual incidents had often been subjected to increased surveillance or intimidation that was documented in subsequent police reports. These patterns of retaliation against community members who had cooperated with law enforcement provided additional evidence of the criminal organization's sophistication and ruthlessness. The systematic targeting of individuals who had reported suspicious activities suggested that the organization had been monitoring police records and identifying residents who posed potential threats to their operations. Chief Wells worked with Detective Chun to develop enhanced security measures for residents who had provided information to the investigation, recognizing that their cooperation might expose them to retaliation from criminal organizations that had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats to their operations. These security measures included increased patrol coverage, emergency communication procedures, and coordination with federal agencies that had resources for protecting witnesses in dangerous investigations. Asterisk. The comprehensive records review also revealed the extent to which routine police work had been documenting evidence of criminal activities without recognizing the significance of individual incidents. The patient work of filing reports, maintaining logs, and preserving records had created a detailed historical record that provided crucial insights into criminal operations that had remained hidden for decades. This discovery reinforced the importance of maintaining detailed records and documentation even for seemingly minor incidents, recognizing that the significance of individual events might not become apparent until they were analyzed in the context of broader patterns and extended timeframes. The systematic approach to record-keeping that had characterized the Millbrook Police Department over the years had provided the foundation for understanding complex criminal activities that might otherwise have remained undetected. Detective Chun's analysis of the complete records review revealed that the criminal organization had been operating in Millbrook for at least 30 years, with activities that had evolved and expanded over time as opportunities arose and methods were refined. The organization had demonstrated remarkable patience and persistence, maintaining long-term surveillance and intelligence-gathering operations while waiting for optimal opportunities to act against specific targets. The records also showed that the criminal activities had been carefully timed to avoid detection by taking advantage of periods when law enforcement attention was focused elsewhere or when community awareness might be reduced due to seasonal factors or other circumstances. This strategic timing suggested sophisticated planning and access to information about law enforcement, operations, and community activities. Officer Kim's detailed analysis of neighborhood reports revealed that residents had been providing valuable intelligence about criminal activities for years without recognizing the significance of their observations. The systematic review of these reports had identified patterns and connections that had not been apparent when the incidents were reported individually, demonstrating the value of comprehensive analysis in understanding complex criminal operations. Neighborhood reports also revealed the extent to which community members had been serving as informal security networks, observing and reporting unusual activities that contributed to the overall safety and security of their residential areas. This community awareness had provided crucial information for the investigation, even though the individual residents had not understood the broader significance of their observations. The patient work of reviewing records and reports had also revealed several missed opportunities for intervention that might have prevented some of the criminal activities or identified the organization's operations earlier. These missed opportunities were not the result of negligence or incompetence, but rather reflected the difficulty of recognizing sophisticated criminal operations that were designed to remain hidden and avoid detection. Learning from these missed opportunities, Detective Chun developed enhanced procedures for analyzing incident reports and identifying patterns that might indicate organized criminal activities. These procedures included systematic cross-referencing of reports, regular analysis of geographical and temporal patterns, and coordination with other agencies to identify connections that might not be apparent within single jurisdictions. Comprehensive records review had required months of patient work, examining thousands of documents and incident reports to identify patterns and connections that revealed the scope and sophistication of the criminal operations. This work had been tedious and time-consuming, but it had provided the foundation for understanding criminal activities that had affected the community for generations. Asterisk. As winter deepened over the valley and the investigation continued its methodical progress, the patient work of examining reports and records had revealed the extraordinary value of systematic documentation and analysis in understanding complex criminal activities. The routine paperwork that formed the daily foundation of police work had become the key to unlocking mysteries that had puzzled investigators for decades. The systematic approach to analyzing records and reports had also demonstrated the importance of recognizing that significant criminal investigations often depended more on careful analysis of routine information than on dramatic discoveries or breakthrough moments. The patient work of examining mundane documents had provided insights that were more valuable than any single piece of dramatic evidence could have provided. Detective Chun's coordination of the comprehensive records review had established new standards for analyzing complex criminal operations, demonstrating techniques and approaches that would be valuable for future investigations involving organized criminal activities. The methods developed during the Millbrook investigation would contribute to law enforcement capabilities for understanding and combating sophisticated criminal organizations in rural communities across the region. The records review had also revealed the crucial role that community members played in providing information and observations that contributed to law enforcement effectiveness. The systematic analysis of resident reports had demonstrated that community awareness and cooperation were essential elements in detecting and combating criminal activities that were designed to remain hidden from official observation. As the investigation moved toward its next phase, the patient work of examining reports and records had provided the solid foundation of evidence and understanding that would be necessary for successful prosecution of the criminal activities and protection of community members who had been affected by decades of organized crime. The quiet work of analyzing paperwork had proven to be as important as any other aspect of the complex investigation that continued to unfold in the peaceful valley of Millbrook. The first snow of winter had fallen gently over Millbrook during the night, transforming the familiar streets and buildings into a landscape that seemed both peaceful and somehow different, as though the white covering had revealed aspects of the community that had been hidden beneath the ordinary surface of daily life. As residents emerged from their homes on that quiet December morning, many noticed that something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of their town. Though few could articulate exactly what that change might be, Mrs. Henderson, unlocking the door of her general store, as she had every morning for the past 15 years, paused on the front steps to observe the scene before her. The snow-covered main street stretched away in both directions, marked only by the tire tracks of the early morning delivery trucks and the footprints of a few residents making their way to work or morning errands. Yet something about the familiar scene struck her as different, charged with an undercurrent of awareness that had not been present in previous winters. Inside the store, as Mrs. Henderson began her routine of checking inventory and preparing for the day's customers, she found herself thinking about conversations and observations that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried new weight in light of the heightened awareness that had settled over the community. The investigation that had begun with Mrs. Ashford's simple observation about Robert Thornfield's evening activities had gradually awakened a collective consciousness about details that residents had previously accepted without question. Thomas Chun, arranging the morning's produce display outside his family's grocery, noticed that several regular customers approached him with questions and observations that would have been unusual just months earlier. People who had previously exchanged only polite greetings now lingered to discuss their observations of unusual activities, their concerns about community security, and their memories of incidents that had occurred years earlier but had taken on new significance. In the changed atmosphere, the postal worker, Jim Morrison, found that his daily route had become a conduit for information exchange, as residents who had rarely engaged in more than casual conversation now sought opportunities to share their observations and concerns. The mailboxes and front porches that had been simple stops along his route had become gathering points for informal discussions about community awareness and the subtle changes that everyone could sense but few could define precisely. Asterisk. Crime Stories for Sleep, Volume 8. Shifting Atmosphere. Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? The first snow of winter had fallen gently over Millbrook during the night, transforming the familiar streets and buildings into a landscape that seemed both peaceful and somehow different, as though the white covering had revealed aspects of the community that had been hidden beneath the ordinary surface of daily life. As residents emerged from their homes on that quiet December morning, many noticed that something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of their town. Though few could articulate exactly what that change might be, Mrs. Henderson, unlocking the door of her general store, as she had every morning for the past 15 years, paused on the front steps to observe the scene before her. The snow-covered main street stretched away in both directions, marked only by the tire tracks of the early morning delivery trucks and the footprints of a few residents making their way to work or morning errands. Yet something about the familiar scene struck her as different, charged with an undercurrent of awareness that had not been present in previous winters. Inside the store, as Mrs. Henderson began her routine of checking inventory and preparing for the day's customers, she found herself thinking about conversations and observations that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried new weight in light of the heightened awareness that had settled over the community. The investigation that had begun with Mrs. Ashford's simple observation about Robert Thornfield's evening activities had gradually awakened a collective consciousness about details that residents had previously accepted without question. Thomas Chun, arranging the morning's produce display outside his family's grocery, noticed that several regular customers approached him with questions and observations that would have been unusual just months earlier. People who had previously exchanged only polite greetings now lingered to discuss their observations of unusual activities, their concerns about community security, and their memories of incidents that had occurred years earlier but had taken on new significance in the Fanjian changed atmosphere. The postal worker, Jim Morrison, found that his daily route had become a conduit for information exchange, as residents who had rarely engaged in more than casual conversation now sought opportunities to share their observations and concerns. The mailboxes and front porches that had been simple stops along his route had become gathering points for informal discussions about community awareness and the subtle changes that everyone could sense but few could define precisely. At Murphy's Tavern, Sean Murphy noticed that the evening conversations among his regular patrons had taken on a different character, with discussions that once focused primarily on weather, farming, and local gossip, now including careful observations about unfamiliar vehicles, unusual activities, and changes in the patterns of daily life that had characterized the area for generations. The atmosphere in the tavern had become more watchful, with patrons paying closer attention to newcomers and maintaining awareness of conversations that might once have been ignored. The change in community atmosphere was particularly noticeable to Chief Wells and her officers, who found that residents were more likely to report unusual activities and more willing to discuss concerns that they might previously have dismissed as unimportant. The enhanced awareness had created an informal network of observation and communication that supplemented official law enforcement activities while reflecting the community's growing understanding that their peaceful valley had been the site of sophisticated criminal operations for decades. Officer Martinez, conducting his regular patrols through the residential neighborhoods, observed that residents were taking more active roles in monitoring their surroundings and maintaining awareness of activities that might affect community security. Porch lights remained on longer into the evening hours. Window blinds were positioned to allow observation of street activities, and neighbors engaged in more frequent conversations about their shared observations and concerns. The shift in community Atmosphere was also reflected in the increased frequency of visits to the police station by residents who wanted to discuss their memories of past incidents or share observations about current activities. These visits often involved elderly community members who possessed detailed knowledge of local history and could provide context for understanding patterns that had developed over extended periods. Eleanor Ashford, whose initial observations had triggered the current investigation, found herself serving as an informal coordinator for community awareness activities, fielding questions from neighbors and organizing discussions about security measures and observation techniques. Her reputation for careful attention to detail and accurate reporting had made her a trusted resource for residents seeking guidance about how to contribute to community safety efforts. The changing atmosphere was particularly evident in the increased attention that residents paid to the activities of individuals who had previously been accepted without question as legitimate community members. Robert Thornfield's evening departures, which had once been noted only by Mrs. Ashford, were now observed by multiple residents who coordinated their observations and shared information about timing, routes, and activities that might be relevant to understanding his true purposes. Similar attention was being paid to other residents whose activities had taken on new significance in light of the investigation's revelations about systematic surveillance and criminal operations. Individuals who had maintained low profiles in the community found themselves subject to increased scrutiny from neighbors who had become more aware of the importance of understanding who was living among them and what their true purposes might be. The enhanced community awareness also led to the recovery of memories and observations that had been overlooked or forgotten during the years when residents had not understood their potential significance. Longtime residents began recalling incidents and individuals from previous decades that might be relevant to understanding the historical patterns of criminal activity that had been identified through the investigation. Mrs. Patterson, whose observations of alley surveillance had been among the early reports in the current investigation, spent considerable time reviewing her memories of unusual activities over the years, identifying patterns and connections that had not been apparent when individual incidents occurred. Her detailed recollections provided valuable information about the timing and methods of surveillance activities that had been conducted in her neighborhood over extended periods. Mr. Davidson from the bank found that his professional knowledge of local financial activities, combined with his enhanced awareness of potential criminal operations, allowed him to identify patterns in banking and real estate transactions that might be connected to the systematic property fraud that had been uncovered through the investigation. His cooperation with law enforcement investigators had provided crucial information about financial aspects of the criminal activities. The couple on Pine Avenue, whose observations of mailbox surveillance had contributed to the early stages of the investigation, worked together to compile comprehensive records of unusual activities they had witnessed over the years. Their systematic approach to documenting and analyzing their observations had provided a model for other residents seeking to contribute to community security efforts. The shifting atmosphere in Millbrook was also reflected in changes to daily routines and security practices that residents implemented in response to their enhanced awareness of potential threats. Many households installed new lighting systems, upgraded door and window locks, and established communication networks with neighbors that allowed for rapid sharing of information about unusual activities. Local businesses modified their operating procedures to include enhanced attention to unusual customers or activities that might be connected to criminal operations. Store owners and service providers began maintaining more detailed records of transactions and customer interactions, recognizing that such information might be valuable for law enforcement investigations. The library and historical society experienced increased interest in genealogical records and local history materials as residents sought to understand their family connections and potential vulnerabilities to criminal targeting. The enhanced community awareness had created interest in understanding the historical context that had made Millbrook attractive to organized criminal operations. Detective Chun observed that the changing community atmosphere was creating both opportunities and challenges for the ongoing investigation. The increased resident awareness and cooperation provided valuable information and support for law enforcement activities, but it also raised concerns about community members taking actions that might interfere with official operations or place themselves in danger. The detective worked with Chief Wells to develop guidelines for community involvement in security awareness activities, providing residents with information about how to contribute to safety efforts while avoiding actions that might compromise official investigations or create security risks. These guidelines emphasize the importance of reporting observations to law enforcement authorities rather than attempting independent investigation or confrontation of suspicious individuals. The enhanced community awareness also created challenges for maintaining operational security for ongoing surveillance and investigation activities. The increased attention that residents were paying to unusual activities made it more difficult for law enforcement officers to conduct discreet operations without being noticed by community members who were actively monitoring their neighborhoods. Chief Wells addressed these challenges by improving communication with community members about the general nature of ongoing law enforcement activities, providing enough information to maintain public confidence and cooperation, while preserving operational security for sensitive investigations. This balance required careful judgment about how much information could be shared without compromising the effectiveness of law enforcement operations. The shift in atmosphere in Millbrook was also reflected in changes to community social activities and gatherings. The monthly town social events, which had traditionally been casual affairs focused on socializing, entertainment, now included informal discussions about community security and awareness. Residents used these gatherings to share information and coordinate security efforts while maintaining the social connections that had always been central to community life. Religious services and community organization meetings also became venues for discussing security concerns and organizing cooperative efforts to enhance community safety. These discussions were conducted with the understanding that community security was a shared responsibility that required cooperation among all residents rather than relying solely on law enforcement authorities. The enhanced community awareness extended beyond Millbrook itself to include increased attention to activities and individuals in surrounding rural areas. Farmers and other rural residents began communicating more frequently with town residents about unusual activities they had observed, creating a broader network of awareness that encompassed the entire valley area where criminal operations had been conducted. This expanded awareness network proved valuable for identifying patterns and connections that might not have been apparent when observations were limited to individual communities. The coordination among residents of different areas provided a more comprehensive picture of criminal activities and helped identify potential threats that might affect multiple communities. Officer Kim worked with residents to organize and coordinate the enhanced awareness activities, providing training and guidance about observation techniques and reporting procedures that would be most helpful for law enforcement investigations. Her knowledge of the community and its residents made her an effective liaison between official law enforcement activities and community-based security efforts. The training sessions that Officer Kim conducted focused on teaching residents how to observe and document suspicious activities without placing themselves in danger or interfering with law enforcement operations. The sessions emphasized the importance of maintaining normal routines and activities while being more attentive to unusual circumstances that might indicate criminal activities. The changing atmosphere in Millbrook also influenced the activities of individuals who might be connected to criminal operations, as the enhanced community awareness made it more difficult to conduct surveillance and intelligence gathering without being noticed. Several residents reported observing individuals who appeared to be monitoring community activities more carefully and modifying their routines in response to increased attention from residents. Robert Thornfield's evening activities continued according to his established pattern, but residents noted subtle changes in his behavior that suggested awareness of increased scrutiny. His routes to and from Murphy's Tavern occasionally included additional detours and delays that might be intended to determine whether he was being observed or followed by community members or law enforcement personnel. The atmosphere at Murphy's Tavern itself had been affected by the enhanced community awareness, with patrons paying closer attention to conversations and activities that might be connected to criminal operations. Sean Murphy noted that some regular customers had become more discreet in their discussions, while others had become more willing to share information about unusual activities they had observed. Detective Chun's analysis of the changing community atmosphere revealed that the enhanced awareness was having measurable effects on criminal activities in the area. The increased attention to unusual activities and the improved communication among residents were making it more difficult for unknown individuals to conduct surveillance and intelligence gathering operations without being detected. However, the detective also recognized that the enhanced community awareness needed to be sustained and properly channeled to remain effective over time. The initial enthusiasm for security activities might diminish if residents did not see concrete results from their efforts, or if the demands of maintaining heightened awareness became burdensome in the context of daily life and responsibilities. Chief Wells worked with community leaders to develop long-term strategies for maintaining effective security awareness while preserving the quality of life and social connections that made Millbrook an attractive place to live. These strategies emphasized the importance of integrating security awareness into existing community activities and social networks, rather than creating separate or burdensome security programs. As winter settled more deeply over the valley and the fund, investigation continued its methodical progress. The shifting atmosphere in Millbrook reflected the community's adaptation to new realities about security and safety that had been revealed through the investigation. The enhanced awareness and cooperation among residents had created a more vigilant and connected community that was better prepared to identify and respond to potential threats. The changing atmosphere also reflected the resilience and strength of community bonds that had been tested by the revelation of decades of criminal activity, but had emerged stronger and more unified. The shared commitment to community safety and the cooperative spirit that had characterized the response to security concerns demonstrated the values and social connections that had always defined life in the peaceful valley. The investigation had revealed that Millbrook's residents possessed the awareness, determination, and cooperative spirit necessary to protect their community from criminal operations that had threatened their safety and security for generations. The shifting atmosphere reflected their collective decision to take active roles in maintaining the peaceful and secure environment that they had always treasured and were determined to preserve for future generations.